Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst, quite literally, into a world that's probably a few centuries removed from your usual bedtime routine. Imagine, if you will, not the soft glow of your phone screen or the gentle hum of the refrigerator, but the thick, damp chill of a pre-dawn morning, the kind that seeps right into your bones. You're nestled not in a plush mattress, but on a lumpy pile of straw that's seen better days, possibly better occupants too. The air doesn't smell of your lavender pillow spray. It's thick with wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and maybe even the faint earthy aroma of the family goat who's currently your rather smelly roommate. You'll quickly discover that your modern sensibilities, your expectations of comfort, hygiene, and, well, not dying from a paper cut, might make you uniquely unsuited for this particular adventure. You probably won't survive this, at least not with your sanity or your manicure intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world, so drop that in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you register isn't a gentle sunrise filtering through bespoke blinds, but a profound, almost suffocating darkness. It's cold. Not just a bit nippy, but a deep penetrating cold that makes your teeth ache. You're lying on something scratchy and uneven. That would be your bed, a rough wooden frame, or perhaps just a pile of straw and rags on the packed earth floor. It's less memory foam and more memories of every twig and bug that's ever shared this space with you. Your blanket, if you can call it that, is a coarse woolen thing, heavy but not particularly warm, and smelling faintly of damp sheep and wood smoke. You try to stretch, a sleepy, instinctive movement, but your limbs collide with something warm and breathing. That's probably one of your siblings, or maybe your parents, because personal space is a luxury yet to be invented for people like you. Medieval peasant families, often quite large, typically lived in cramped 1- or 2-roomed dwellings. During the harsh winters, it wasn't uncommon for any precious livestock, a pig, a few chickens, maybe that goat, to be brought inside at night for their protection, and, as a bonus, their body heat. So, yes, your current bedfellows might include Bessie the cow, adding her own unique olfactory signature to the already rich tapestry of smells. Slowly, the world around you begins to gain a dim shape. A sliver of grey light seeps through a crack in the wooden shutters or an ill-fitting door. There are no glass windows here, not for folk like you. At best, you might have openings covered with oiled parchment or cloth, which let in a bit of light but also all of the drafts. Your alarm clock is a rooster with a grudge, or possibly your bladder, whichever screams louder first. There's no gentle nudge from a smartwatch reminding you to prepare for your day. The day simply crashes in, demanding your immediate and full attention. You sit up, the straw rustling loudly in the near silence, and a fresh wave of cold hits your exposed skin. Your clothes, likely the same ones you wore yesterday and the day before that, are probably folded nearby, or perhaps you even slept in them for extra warmth. They're made of rough homespun wool or linen, itchy, stiff, and not particularly clean. The concept of daily changes of clothes, let alone pyjamas, is laughably futuristic. You pull them on, the fabric feeling like a mild exfoliant against your skin. The air quality in your humble abode makes a modern city during rush hour seem like a pristine mountain retreat. The central hearth, a simple fire pit in the middle of the room, would have smouldered through the night, and with no proper chimney, just a hole in the thatched roof. The smoke has nowhere to go but everywhere. It stings your eyes, catches in your throat, and has permanently infused everything you own with its acrid perfume. It's a smell you'll come to associate with home, oddly enough. You can hear the sounds of others stirring now. Coughs, grunts, the rustle of more straw beds. Someone is already trying to coax the embers in the hearth back to life. There's no flicking a switch for instant light or heat. Everything requires effort, a direct application of your own energy. As your eyes adjust, you make out the basic shapes of your home. A low-roofed single room. The walls are probably wattle and daub, woven branches plastered with mud, straw and animal dung, or rough-hewn timber. The floor is packed earth, cold and damp under your bare feet, because shoes are a luxury you might not possess, or if you do, they're reserved for outdoor use. You might notice a small, curious object hanging by the doorframe or tucked into the thatch. Perhaps a hagstone, a stone with a naturally formed hole through it. This quirky little piece of geology was believed to ward off evil spirits, nightmares, and, crucially for our story later, witches. It's a tiny testament to the everyday superstitions that permeate this world, a world where the veil between the mundane and the magical is incredibly thin. Looking around, you see the entirety of your family's possessions. A few wooden stools, a rough table if you're fortunate, some pottery bowls and wooden spoons, an iron cooking pot hanging over the hearth. There are no cupboards bursting with snacks, no bookshelves lined with stories, no decorative knickknacks. Everything here is functional, essential. Privacy is non-existent. Every bodily function, every argument, every moment of tenderness or sorrow happens in this shared space, under the watchful eyes and listening ears of your entire family. Historians still argue whether the typical medieval peasant truly felt a deep personal connection to the wider concept of nation, or if their loyalties were almost exclusively local, tied to their village and feudal lord, their world largely confined to the few square miles they knew. Your world, for now, is this smoky, crowded, and profoundly uncomfortable hut. The day hasn't even properly begun, and already it's a struggle for basic existence, a stark contrast to the life you left behind only moments ago in your dreams. The sun isn't fully up, but the demands of this medieval life are already pressing in. The meagre light filtering into your hut doesn't signal a gentle awakening followed by a leisurely scroll through social media. Oh no, it's more like the starting gun for a marathon you didn't sign up for, run on an empty stomach, uphill, both ways. You stumble out of the low doorway, ducking your head if you're of average modern height, because medieval peasants weren't exactly known for their towering stature. Nutrition, or lack thereof, plays a funny role in things like that. The village air, though still smoky, carries the scent of damp earth, animal manure, a constant companion really, and perhaps the slightly more appetizing smell of someone else's bread baking, if they're lucky enough to have an oven and flour to spare. Your stomach rumbles, a hollow, demanding sound. Breakfast, if you get any, will be a chunk of coarse, dark bread, maybe washed down with some watered-down ale or small beer, because water sources could be notoriously unreliable, and the brewing process thankfully killed off some of the nastier microscopic critters. Forget your artisanal sourdough or your oat milk latte. This is fuel, plain and simple, and often not enough of it. Your first task is likely fetching water from the village well, or a nearby stream, a communal activity that doubles as the morning news and gossip exchange. The bucket is heavy, wooden, and probably leaky. Then it's off to the fields. Your commute doesn't involve traffic jams or crowded trains, just to trudge along muddy tracks, your bare feet or crude leather shoes sinking into the mire. The fields stretch out around the village, vast and often windswept. These aren't the neatly manicured, machine-tended landscapes you might picture. They are rugged, uneven, and demanding. And now, the real fun begins. Depending on the season, your day will be consumed by a relentless cycle of agricultural tasks. If it's spring, you're probably wrestling with a heavy wooden plough, likely pulled by a team of equally weary-looking oxen. This isn't your granddad's charming old garden tiller. It's a cumbersome beast that requires immense physical strength to guide. The handles are rough, designed more for durability than, say, ergonomic comfort, a concept that would get you laughed right out of the feudal system. You lean your whole body into it, muscles screaming as you carve furrows into the heavy, often clay-like soil. The sun, when it finally climbs high enough, beats down on your back, or perhaps it's a cold, drizzling rain soaking you to the bone. There are no weatherproof Gore-Tex jackets here, just your woolen tunic clinging uncomfortably to your skin. A mainstream historical fact for you. Many villages operated on a 3-field system of crop rotation. One field would be planted with wheat or rye in the autumn, another with spring crops like barley, oats or peas, and the third would be left fallow to recover its fertility. This was a significant improvement over earlier 2-field systems, boosting overall food production, but it still meant an enormous amount of land to work. You'd spend countless hours sowing seeds by hand, a repetitive backbending task, scattering your hopes for the next harvest with every flick of your wrist. Then comes weeding, an endless battle against thistles and other unwelcome invaders, all done manually, often on your hands and knees. The lord of the manor, whose land you primarily work, expects his share, and it's the lion's share, naturally. You're a serf, tied to this land by birth. You're not quite a slave, but you're definitely not free. Several days a week, your labour is dedicated entirely to the Lord's domain, his personal fields. This is called week work. Any improvements you make, any bumper crop that results from your sweat, primarily benefits him. It's like working for a company where the CEO takes 90% of your paycheck and gives you a lukewarm pat on the back if you're lucky. Then, if you're fortunate, you have a few small strips of land of your own, scattered amongst the Lord's holdings, to cultivate for your family's survival. The pressure to get your own crops planted, tended and harvested in the time left over is immense. Harvest time is a period of frantic activity, everyone from the youngest able-bodied child to the oldest creaking grandparent pressed into service. You'll be out with a sickle or scythe, cutting wheat, barley or oats from dawn till dusk. The work is relentless, the sun blazing, dust filling your lungs, your hands raw and blistered. The scythe, while more efficient than a sickle for some crops, was also notoriously dangerous if handled carelessly. Workplace safety meetings were, shall we say, infrequent. Beyond the fields there are other tasks. Animals need tending. The oxen, perhaps a cow for milk, a few pigs rooting around. Firewood needs to be gathered from the woods, a constant necessity for cooking and warmth, but you must be careful not to poach from the Lord's designated hunting forests, as the penalties for taking even a rabbit could be severe. Tools need mending, fences need repairing. For the women, the work is no less arduous. Alongside field work, they'd be responsible for processing food, spinning wool or flax into thread, weaving cloth, brewing ale, baking bread, if they had access to an oven, childcare and tending the small vegetable garden near the hut, which provided crucial additions to the diet. Historians still argue whether the daily life of a peasant was one of unmitigated drudgery, or if there were more spaces for small joys and personal agency than the harshest accounts suggest. Let's not forget the little rituals. Before the ploughing season, some communities might have engaged in Plough Monday celebrations, where ploughs were decorated and dragged through the village, accompanied by music and revelry, a folk custom perhaps intended to bless the coming agricultural year. This quirky tidbit shows a desire to find meaning and hope amidst the hardship. These small breaks were rare, though. The default setting is toil. As the light begins to fade, often well after sunset during the busy seasons, you trudge back to your hut, every muscle aching, your body coated in dirt and sweat. There's no hot shower waiting, no comfortable sofa to collapse onto. The reward for your day's labour is the prospect of doing it all again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Your existence is a precarious one, dependent on the weather, the whims of your lord and your own physical endurance. You might have a little more food in your belly than you did this morning, but true security, comfort, or the chance for significant personal advancement, those are dreams for another life, another time. For now, there is only the profound weariness and the brief respite of sleep before the medieval dawn beckons once more. Right, so you've survived your first and second medieval sunrise and the subsequent back-breaking labour in the fields. Your muscles are probably screaming in protest, a symphony of aches you never knew possible. But now, let's talk about something near and dear to modern hearts, hygiene, or in this case, the almost comical lack thereof. If you thought sharing your bed with livestock was an olfactory adventure, just wait until you get a whiff of general medieval sanitation. You might want to hold your breath for this next bit, though, frankly, in the 14th century, that wouldn't help you much for long. The concept of clean is about to be radically redefined for you, mostly downwards. After a long day toiling in the sun, covered in dirt, sweat, and who knows what else from the fields. Remember, fertilizer wasn't exactly bagged and pelletized back then. Animal manure was prime stuff. Your first instinct might be to hop into a nice hot shower. You can forget that. Showers, as you know them, are centuries away. Even a proper bath is a rare luxury, not a daily or even weekly ritual for most peasants. Water, as we touched upon, had to be hauled, often from a considerable distance. Heating that water required precious firewood and a lot of time. So, a full immersion bath. That was an event, perhaps indulged in a few times a year if you were feeling particularly decadent or had a special occasion, like not being covered in quite so much mud. Your daily ablutions, if they happen at all, are more likely to consist of a quick splash of cold water on your face and hands from a basin. Soap, if available to common folk, was a harsh lye-based substance, often homemade and smelling rather rustic. It wasn't your lavender and chamomile body wash, let's put it that way. It was more for scouring clothes than tender skin. Many people simply wouldn't have bothered with soap regularly for personal washing. They'd just wipe off the worst of the grime with a damp cloth, if that. You'd quickly develop a certain tolerance for your own body odour, and indeed for everyone else's. Personal scent was just a fact of life, like the wind or the rain. A mainstream historical fact. Public bathhouses did exist in medieval towns and cities, and they were often popular social hubs, but for a rural peasant access to such facilities was highly unlikely. Plus, by the later Middle Ages, many bathhouses gained a reputation for, shall we say, less than wholesome activities, and some were even closed down due to moral concerns or fears of disease spread. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the contents of the chamber pot. There's no ensuite bathroom in your wattle and daub hut. No gleaming porcelain throne. Your toilet is likely a simple pottery or wooden bucket kept in a corner, and when it's full, you'd empty it outside, perhaps into a designated cesspit or dung heap, if your village was particularly organised. If not, well, the contents might just be tossed into the street or onto the general refuse pile. Gardy-loo was the cry in some medieval towns when people emptied their chamber pots from upper windows, a friendly warning to pedestrians below. While perhaps more urban, the general principle of waste just going somewhere nearby applies. The streets of a medieval village weren't paved with gold. They were more likely paved with mud, animal droppings and general household refuse. Think about your clothes again. Those rough woolen or linen garments we mentioned. You don't have an extensive wardrobe. You might own 2, perhaps 3 outfits at most. Washing clothes was a major undertaking, usually done in a river or stream, beating the dirt out with the rocks or wooden paddles, using harsh soaps or sometimes even urine for its ammonia content to bleach fabrics. This wasn't something you did daily. You wore your clothes until they were stiff with grime or utterly unbearable. And since your outer garments were often wool, which naturally repels some dirt and water, they were washed even less frequently than linen undergarments. You'd just air them out, or pick off the visible bits. Dental hygiene. If you thought a quick splash of water was rudimentary, wait till you hear about teeth. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist. People might have rubbed their teeth with a rough cloth, perhaps with some salt or chalk. Twigs from certain trees like hazel were sometimes chewed to a frayed end and used as a primitive brush. Bad breath must have been absolutely epic. Tooth decay and gum disease were rampant, and if you had a toothache, the solution was often extraction, performed by the local barber surgeon with a terrifying set of pliers and no anaesthetic. You'd probably just learn to live with a certain level of oral discomfort. Hair care was similarly basic. Lice were common companions, an accepted part of life. People might comb their hair with wooden or bone combs, which helped remove some lice and nits, but eradication was a constant battle. Washing hair involved similar processes to washing clothes: harsh soap, cold water. Many women kept their hair covered with veils or wimples, which conveniently hid a multitude of sins, or rather, dirt. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly as oblivious to filth as some popular depictions suggest, or if they simply had different standards and practices born of necessity. Some argue that there were efforts towards cleanliness, pointing to monastic rules about washing or guild regulations in towns. However, for the average peasant in a rural village, the resources and knowledge for modern standards of hygiene were simply absent. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Medieval medical theory, based on the ancient Greek idea of the 4 humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, sometimes discouraged excessive bathing. It was believed that too much washing could open the pores and make the body vulnerable to disease by allowing bad air or miasma to enter. So in a strange way, avoiding baths could occasionally be seen as a health-conscious decision, albeit one based on entirely flawed medical understanding. It's like today when someone says they're doing a juice cleanse to remove toxins, except this cleanse involves actively accumulating grime. So, you're living in a world where the ambient smell is a rich bouquet of unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting refuse, and wood smoke. Your clothes are scratchy and rarely clean. Your mouth tastes like, well, let's not dwell on that. Diseases related to poor sanitation, dysentery, typhoid, were common. You'd quickly learn to step carefully through the village, avoiding the worst of the muck. The very air you breathe, the ground you walk on, the clothes you wear, all carry a level of grime that would send a modern health inspector into a dead faint. It's a far cry from antibacterial hand gel and twice-daily showers, and as we'll see, these conditions could also contribute to the spread of much more terrifying illnesses, but for now, just try to get used to being perpetually, fundamentally a bit grubby. It's the medieval way. Alright, so you're unwashed, overworked, and generally uncomfortable. Your stomach is probably performing a dramatic monologue about its emptiness by now, having only had that lump of coarse bread and weak ale hours ago. What does dinner look like in your humble medieval peasant abode? Let's just say it's not a gourmet food delivery app away. Forget takeout menus, calorie counting, or debates about organic versus conventional. Your primary concern is simply enough, and variety. That's a luxury for the folks in the big stone castle on the hill. The centrepiece of your diet, day in and day out, is bread. But this isn't your fluffy artisan sourdough or your seeded whole wheat loaf. This is likely maslin bread, made from a mixture of wheat and rye, or even coarser stuff made from barley or oats if the wheat harvest was poor. It's dense, it's dark, and it requires serious jaw power to get through. It's the kind of bread that could double as a doorstop, or possibly a minor weapon in a pinch. It's filling, certainly, providing the bulk of your calories, but not exactly a taste sensation. Sometimes, if things were really tough, the flour might be bulked out with less appetizing additions like ground beans, peas, or even, in times of famine, tree bark or acorns. Yum. What do you eat with your bread? Well, that depends heavily on the season and what you've managed to grow in your small garden plot or forage from the common lands. The most common accompaniment is a pottage, a thick stew or porridge that simmers away over the hearth for much of the day. The ingredients are whatever is available, root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots, though medieval carrots were often purple or white, not orange. Leafy greens like cabbage, kale, and spinach, onions, leeks, and perhaps peas or beans if they're in season. It's a one-pot meal, economical with fuel and ingredients. Think of it as a medieval crock pot, but instead of delicious pulled pork you get turnip surprise. Again, meat is a rarity for the average peasant. Large game like deer was reserved for the nobility. Poaching carried severe penalties, as we mentioned, sometimes even death or mutilation. You might keep a pig, which would be slaughtered in the autumn, providing precious salted pork or bacon to last through the winter. Chickens, if you had them, were more valuable for their eggs than their meat. An old hen might end up in the pottage pot when she stopped laying, but it would be a tough old bird. Beef was generally out of reach unless an ox died of old age or accident. So for the most part your pottage is a vegetarian affair, perhaps flavoured with a bit of bacon fat if you're lucky, or some herbs from your garden, parsley, sage, thyme. Fish might feature more regularly if you lived near a river or the coast. Common catches included eels, pike, bream and perch. The church also played a role here, as meat was forbidden on certain days, Fridays during Lent and other religious observances, making fish a dietary staple, a mainstream historical fact. Medieval people consumed a surprising amount of fish, much of it preserved by salting, smoking or drying to make it last. Herring, known as the king of fish for its abundance and affordability, was a particularly important food source. Imagine the smell of a barrel of salted herring. It's an acquired taste, much like everything else in your new life. Dairy products offer some variety. If your family owns a cow, you'll have milk, though it won't be pasteurised and would need to be consumed quickly or turned into cheese or butter. Cheese, especially the harder aged varieties, was a good way to preserve milk solids and provided valuable protein. You might have green cheese, fresh unripened cheese, or something a bit more potent. Butter was a prized fat, used in cooking if you could afford it. What about fruits? Apples, pears and plums might grow in your village, and wild berries like blackberries and raspberries could be foraged in season. These would be eaten fresh or preserved, perhaps dried or made into a simple fruit pottage. Honey, harvested from wild bees or kept hives, was the primary sweetener, as sugar was an incredibly expensive imported luxury, far beyond the reach of a peasant. You wouldn't be sprinkling sugar on your medieval equivalent of cornflakes, mainly because cornflakes didn't exist and sugar was like gold dust. Drinks? Water, as we've discussed, could be dodgy. Ale or small beer was the everyday drink for almost everyone, including children, because the brewing process made it safer than water. It was generally low in alcohol content compared to modern beers, more of a hydrating, calorie-providing beverage. Wine was produced in some regions, but was often more expensive and consumed by wealthier classes or on special occasions. Cider was also common in apple-growing areas. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasant diet was truly as grim and monotonous as it often sounds, or if there was more seasonal variation and foraging skill involved than records fully capture. Some evidence suggests that, when harvests were good and foraging successful, the diet could be reasonably diverse and nutritious, at least in terms of micronutrients from vegetables and herbs. However, it was always precarious, and a bad harvest could quickly lead to widespread hunger and malnutrition. Here's a quirky tidbit. Trenchers were commonly used instead of plates. These were thick slices of stale bread, about 4 days old, on which the food was served. After the meal, the gravy-soaked trencher might be eaten by the diner if they were still hungry, given to the dogs, or distributed to the poor. It's the ultimate in edible, biodegradable dinnerware. Just don't expect a clean plate policy. So you gather around the smoky hearth as dusk falls, dipping your hunk of coarse bread into the communal pottage pot with your fingers or a simple wooden spoon. The flavours are earthy, often bland, sometimes a little bitter depending on the greens. There's no salt and pepper shaker on the table. Salt was valuable, and spices were astronomically expensive. The meal is eaten quickly, without much ceremony. It's about refuelling your body for the next day's labour. You chew, you swallow, you try to ignore the grit that sometimes finds its way into the bread. From the millstones, this is your sustenance. It's what keeps you alive, but it's a world away from the culinary delights you're used to. Your taste buds, like the rest of you, are in for a serious adjustment period, and you'd better hope the harvest is good this year, because the alternative is truly frightening. Having navigated the joys of medieval dawn, peasant labour, questionable hygiene, and a diet that makes plain oatmeal look exotic, it's time to understand your place in this new, old world. And the first rule of Medieval Society Club is, you don't talk about moving up in Medieval Society Club, because mostly you can't. Your birth certificate, if such a fancy document even existed for someone like you, might as well have stuck stamped across it in big muddy letters. Social mobility is less a ladder and more a very, very sticky floor. You are a peasant, most likely a serf. This isn't just a job title. It's a fundamental state of being, defining almost every aspect of your existence from cradle to grave. The bedrock of this society is feudalism, a hierarchical system where land is exchanged for service and loyalty. At the very top you have the king, who theoretically owns all the land. He grants large chunks of it to his powerful nobles, dukes, earls, barons, in exchange for their military support and counsel. These nobles in turn grant smaller parcels of their land, known as manors, to lesser lords or knights. And at the very bottom of this pyramid, that's you, my friend. You don't own land, you belong to the land. As a serf, you are tied to the manor on which you were born. You cannot leave without the lord's permission, which is rarely granted. Think of it like an unbreakable lease agreement, but instead of an apartment, it's your entire life, and the landlord can also tell you who to marry. If the manor is sold or granted to a new lord, you and your family go with it, like fixtures and fittings. You are, quite literally, part of the property. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? Your dreams of backpacking across Europe, or even just visiting the next village over for a change of scenery, shelve them indefinitely. Your primary obligation is to work for the lord of the manor. Remember those grueling days in the field we talked about? A significant portion of that labour, typically 2 or 3 days a week, known as week work, is performed on the lord's demesne, his private lands, for his direct benefit. During busy periods like planting or harvest, you'll owe him extra days, called boon work. You do this unpaid, of course. It's part of your rent, your duty. In addition to labour services, you also owe him a portion of whatever you produce on your own small strips of land. This could be a share of your crops, a few chickens, some eggs, or perhaps a bit of honey. It's a constant drain on your already meagre resources. The lord of the manor is more than just your landlord. He's your ruler, your judge, and your military commander, though you're unlikely to be doing much fighting beyond a village brawl. He presides over the manor court, which settles local disputes, punishes petty crimes, and enforces the rules of the manor. If you have a grievance with a neighbour, you take it to the manor court. If you're caught poaching a rabbit from his woods, you'll face his justice, which can be swift and harsh. Forget appealing to a higher authority. For most practical purposes, his word is law. There are other, more personal obligations. You might need the lord's permission to marry, and when you do, you often have to pay a fee called a merchet. If your daughter marries someone from outside the manor, The fee could be even higher, as the lord is losing a potential labourer. If you die, your heir, usually your eldest son, will have to pay a heriot, often the best animal you owned, to the lord in order to inherit your tenancy and meagre belongings. It's a system designed to keep the wealth and power concentrated at the top, ensuring a continuous supply of labour for the land. Even your death is a taxable event. How's that for frustrating? A mainstream historical fact. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086 for William the Conqueror, provides an incredibly detailed snapshot of English society and landholding at the time. It meticulously recorded who owned what, how much land they had, how many peasants worked it, and what resources were available. It was essentially a massive audit to assess the taxable wealth of the kingdom, and it underscores just how central land and its associated obligations were. Within the peasant community itself, there might be subtle gradations. Some peasants, known as freemen, were not tied to the land in the same way as serfs. They might own a bit more land or have fewer labour obligations, perhaps paying rent in cash instead of service. However, the distinction could be blurry, and their lives were still largely governed by the rhythms of agriculture and the authority of the local lord. There were also village officials like the reeve, usually a peasant chosen by the lord or elected by the villagers, who was responsible for overseeing the farm work on the manor. This position came with some responsibility and perhaps minor perks, but also the unenviable task of making sure your fellow villagers did their work. Historians still argue whether the relationship between lord and peasant was purely exploitative, or if there were elements of mutual obligation and paternalism. Some lords may have seen it as their duty to protect their peasants in times of war or famine, providing a basic safety net, however flimsy. Others undoubtedly saw their serfs as little more than resources to be exploited for maximum profit. The reality, as always, probably varied greatly depending on the individual lord and the specific local conditions. Here's a quirky tidbit for your understanding of social hierarchy. Even clothing was often regulated by sumptuary laws. These laws dictated what different social classes were allowed to wear, right down to the types of fabric, colours and accessories. For example, certain expensive furs or vibrant dyes like scarlet might be reserved for the nobility. The idea was to make social status instantly recognisable and prevent the lower classes from, heaven forbid, looking too much like their betters. So, that fancy silk tunic you might have your eye on? Not a chance. Stick to your drab homespun wool, peasant. It's the law. So you're born into a system that has already decided your path. Your opportunities are severely limited by your social standing. You owe labour, you owe produce, you owe obedience. There's a clear pecking order, and you are very much at the pecking end. Forget about following your dreams or reinventing yourself. Your identity is largely fixed. This rigid social structure is the scaffolding upon which medieval life is built, and understanding your small, often uncomfortable place within it is key to survival. Any attempt to dramatically change your station would be met with suspicion, if not outright punishment. Best to keep your head down, do your work, and hope the Lord is a reasonably fair one. Because in this world, knowing your place isn't just good manners, it's a matter of survival. You've got the social pecking order down, you're resigned to your daily grind, and you've even mostly stopped gagging at the ambient smells. But there's another layer to this medieval world that you need to navigate, one that hums just beneath the surface of everyday life, influencing decisions, explaining misfortunes, and offering a strange kind of comfort, the pervasive belief in charms, omens, and everyday magic. This isn't grand, Gandalf-style wizardry we're talking about, but a tapestry of folk beliefs, superstitions, and minor rituals woven so tightly into the fabric of daily existence that to ignore them would be like ignoring the weather. The air itself feels different here, not just because of the wood smoke and manure. It feels charged, potent. The natural world isn't just a collection of plants, animals, and geographical features. It's alive with spirits, influences, and hidden meanings. A sudden storm, a blight on the crops, a cow that stops giving milk. These aren't just unfortunate events. They could be signs, portents, or the result of some unseen force, benevolent or malevolent. Your medieval mind, unlike your 21st century one, doesn't immediately jump to scientific explanations. It jumps to, well, something else. Everyday life is governed by 1,000 tiny superstitions. Spilling salt isn't just messy, it's bad luck. requiring you to throw a pinch over your left shoulder to ward off the devil supposedly lurking there. A black cat crossing your path, definitely a bad omen. Sorry, cat lovers, but in some medieval contexts, black cats had unfortunate associations with witchcraft, though this varied. Seeing a magpie might require a specific greeting or ritual to avert ill fortune, the significance often depending on how many you saw. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy. Sound familiar? Many of these little beliefs have surprisingly long tendrils into modern folklore. The changing seasons, the phases of the moon, the behaviour of animals, all are closely observed for clues about the future or hidden influences. Certain days of the week or year might be considered lucky or unlucky for specific activities. For instance, it was widely believed that planting or harvesting should be done according to lunar cycles for the best results. Medical treatments such as bloodletting, a very common, if often unhelpful practice, were also often timed according to astrological charts and the position of the moon. Historians still argue whether these folk beliefs existed in direct opposition to the church, or if they coexisted in a more complex syncretic relationship with people often holding both sets of beliefs simultaneously without seeing a contradiction. Charms and amulets are commonplace. Remember that hagstone we mentioned hanging by the door in your hut? That's just one example. You might carry a lucky pebble, a piece of rowan wood, believed to protect against witchcraft, or a pouch containing specific herbs to ward off illness or bad luck. These weren't necessarily seen as magic in the sense of casting spells, but more as tapping into the inherent protective or beneficial properties of certain objects, a kind of natural preventative medicine or insurance policy against the unseen. It's like carrying a lucky rabbit's foot, only the stakes feel considerably higher when it's not just about winning the lottery, but about your child surviving a fever. A mainstream historical fact. Folk magic often centred around practical concerns. Healing the sick, protecting livestock, ensuring good harvests, finding lost objects, or inspiring love. Cunning folk, men or women believed to possess special knowledge of herbs, charms, and rituals, were often consulted for these purposes. They were a part of the community, offering services that the local priest might not, operating in a grey area between accepted folk practice and more suspect forms of magic. Their role was often tolerated, even valued, as long as they were perceived to be doing good and not harm. The natural world is also populated by a host of supernatural beings, distinct from the angels and demons of formal Christian theology. You might believe in fairies, sprites, goblins, or other nature spirits inhabiting the woods, streams and fields. Some could be mischievous, some helpful, some downright dangerous. Leaving out a small offering of milk or bread might appease them and prevent them from souring your milk or leading you astray in the forest. These beliefs were often remnants of older, pre-Christian pagan traditions, absorbed and adapted over centuries. It's like your medieval neighbours have a whole unseen cast of characters influencing their world, and you'd better learn their names and preferences if you want to avoid trouble. That sudden chill you feel in the woods? Not just a draft, my friend. Quirky tidbit. Divination was a popular, if officially frowned upon practice. People sought to foretell the future through various means. Interpreting dreams, oniromancy, scrying, staring into reflective surfaces like water or polished stones, or even observing the patterns made by molten lead dropped into water. Some of these practices were surprisingly elaborate. For example, on certain saints' days, young women might perform rituals to try and divine the identity of their future husbands, perhaps by peeling an apple in one continuous strip and throwing the peel over their shoulder, hoping it would land in the shape of his initial. It's the medieval equivalent of a BuzzFeed quiz, but with more at stake than just finding out which Disney princess you are. These beliefs provide a framework for understanding a world that is often unpredictable and harsh. When your child falls ill, and the priest's prayers don't bring immediate relief, a poultice recommended by the local herb woman, accompanied by a whispered charm, offers another avenue of hope. When your crops fail despite your best efforts, blaming mischievous sprites or an ill omen seen last Tuesday is perhaps easier to bear than confronting the sheer randomness of misfortune or the inadequacies of your farming techniques. This constant awareness of unseen forces, of lucky and unlucky signs, of the power inherent in certain words, objects and actions, adds another layer of complexity to your daily life. You're not just working the land, you're navigating a spiritual landscape, trying to stay on the right side of a multitude of influences, both holy and folkloric. It's a world where a shared glance can carry meaning, a stumble can be a warning, and the hoot of an owl at the wrong time of night can send a shiver of genuine fear down your spine. This underlying hum of everyday magic and superstition is the background radiation of your medieval existence. And, as we'll soon see, this same belief system that offers comfort and explanation can also curdle into something far more sinister when fear takes root and a scapegoat is needed. For now, just remember to check the moon phase before you plant those turnips, and maybe don't walk under any ladders, just in case. So, you're getting the hang of the daily toil, the questionable smells, the rigid social ladder, and even the slightly spooky undercurrent of folk beliefs and everyday charms. But looming over all of this, shaping every aspect of your life from the grandest cathedral down to the humblest prayer whispered at your bedside, is the immense, all-encompassing power of the Church. If feudalism is the skeleton of medieval society, the Church is its heart, lungs and nervous system, pumping lifeblood, dictating breath, and transmitting messages to every single part of the body politic. You cannot escape its influence. It is everywhere, and its eye is always on you. Your village, however small and remote, will have a church. It's likely the largest, most substantial and most impressive building for miles around, probably built of stone while your hut is wattle and daub. It's the centre of community life, not just for worship, but for meetings, celebrations, and sometimes even as a place of refuge. The sound of the church bell dictates the rhythm of your day, calling you to prayer, signalling times of work and rest, tolling for births, deaths and marriages, and warning of dangers like fire or attack. It's the medieval equivalent of a town clock, a public address system, and a spiritual GPS all rolled into one. Your local priest is a hugely important figure. He's likely one of the few literate people in your village. He conducts the Mass in Latin, which you probably don't understand, but the ritual and symbolism are powerful nonetheless. Hears your confession, administers the sacraments, baptism for your newborns, marriage vows, last rites for the dying. These sacraments are seen as essential for salvation, the spiritual milestones that guide your soul through this life, and, crucially, into the next. The priest is your intermediary with God, your guide through the often terrifying spiritual landscape. He might also be a source of news from the wider world, or even offer basic medical advice, though its efficacy might be debatable. Life is lived according to the Christian calendar. Saints' days, religious festivals, and periods like Lent and Advent structure your year, dictating times of fasting and feasting, work and rest. Though rest is a relative term for a peasant, major life events are all marked by religious ceremony. Your understanding of the world, of morality, of your place in the cosmos, is filtered through the teachings of the Church. Heaven is the ultimate reward for a life lived piously and according to God's laws. Hell is the terrifying eternal punishment for sin, and sin, you'll quickly learn, is very easy to stumble into. The Church's power isn't just spiritual, it's also economic and political. A mainstream historical fact. The Church was one of the largest landowners in medieval Europe, possessing vast estates, collecting tithes, a tenth of your produce or income, owed to the Church, and wielding considerable influence over kings and nobles. Cathedrals and monasteries were not just places of worship, but also major economic engines, centres of learning, and administrators of charity. Think of them as medieval mega-corporations with a divine mission statement. This wealth and influence meant that the Church could command immense resources and manpower. The fear of God, and more specifically, the fear of eternal damnation, is a powerful motivator. The walls of your village church might be painted with vivid depictions of the Last Judgment. Christ enthroned in glory, angels welcoming the saved into paradise, and grotesque demons dragging the damned down into the fiery pits of hell. These aren't subtle suggestions. They're graphic, terrifying reminders of what awaits if you stray from the righteous path. It's a very effective way of encouraging good behaviour, or at least outward conformity. Forget CCTV. God's all-seeing eye is far more persuasive, especially when backed up by images of devils with pitchforks. The Church also defines what is considered orthodox belief and what is heresy. Straying from accepted doctrine could have severe consequences, not just in the afterlife, but in this one too. While large-scale heresy hunts were more characteristic of certain periods and regions, the underlying principle that there was one true faith and that deviation was dangerous was deeply ingrained. This is crucial for our later exploration of witchcraft accusations, as perceived challenges to Christian cosmology or power could be interpreted in a very sinister light. Historians still argue whether the average medieval peasant had a deeply personal, internalized faith, or if their religious practice was more about communal ritual and outward observance. Was it a profound spiritual connection, or was it more a matter of doing what was expected to ensure a good harvest, avoid divine punishment, and maintain social cohesion? It was likely a complex mix of both, varying greatly from individual to individual. Here's a quirky tidbit that highlights the church's pervasive influence: the concept of sanctuary. Certain churches and consecrated grounds offered a form of protection to fugitives. If a criminal could reach a sanctuary, they were temporarily safe from arrest and could, in some cases, confess their crime and agree to go into exile, a process known as abjuring the realm. It was a fascinating intersection of law, mercy and religious authority, though not a get-out-of-jail-free card, as conditions were often harsh. Imagine a medieval police chase ending with someone dramatically touching the church door and yelling "Sanctuary." It's not just a movie trope. So, while you might also be appeasing local nature spirits with a splash of milk, as we discussed in the previous section, your primary spiritual allegiance, the one that dictates your moral compass and your hopes for eternity, lies with the church. Its doctrines provide answers to life's big questions, its rituals mark the passage of your life, and its authority is an undeniable fact of your existence. You pay your tithes, you attend Mass, even if you're just going through the motions and trying to stay awake after a hard week. You confess your sins, and you pray for salvation. The church is your shepherd, and you are part of its flock, whether you fully understand the Latin sermon or not. Its teachings will form the lens through which you view good and evil, fortune and misfortune, and ultimately the strange and dangerous accusations that might one day be levelled against someone in your community, or even yourself. The fear of God is real, and so is the power of those who speak in his name. All right, you're navigating the medieval world, juggling back-breaking labour, questionable hygiene, a rigid social hierarchy, a healthy dose of superstition, and the ever-watchful eye of the church. But what happens when you, or someone in your family, falls ill? Or when your prize sow looks a bit peaky? You can't just pop down to the pharmacy for some antibiotics or call the vet. Your options are limited, and this is where you might find yourself dipping a toe into the world of traditional remedies. A fascinating, sometimes effective, often bizarre, and occasionally perilous realm of herbs, healing, and hearsay. Formal, university-trained physicians are incredibly rare and astronomically expensive, serving only the wealthiest nobles and high-ranking clergy. You, as a humble peasant, will never encounter one. Your first port of call for illness might be prayer, and the local priest might offer some solace and spiritual comfort. But for practical physical ailments, you're more likely to turn to local healers. These are often women, wise women, or herb women, who have a traditional knowledge of medicinal plants passed down through generations. They are the village equivalent of your GP, pharmacist, and sometimes even midwife, all rolled into one. Their pharmacy is the fields, forests, and hedgerows around your village. They know which plants can soothe a cough, like coltsfoot or horehound, which can help staunch bleeding. Yarrow is a common one, sometimes called soldier's woundwort, and which might ease a fever. They gather these herbs, dry them, and prepare them as infusions, teas, poultices, or salves. You might trade them some eggs or a bit of cloth for their services or remedies. It's a system based on local knowledge and mutual support. Think of it as a very organic, very local co-op, where the currency is often barter rather than coin. The remedies themselves can range from the sensible to the utterly bewildering. Some herbal treatments we now know do have genuine medicinal properties. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, and was used to treat pain and fever. Foxglove, digitalis, was known, though its use was risky for heart conditions. However, many other remedies were based on the doctrine of signatures, a belief that a plant's appearance indicated its medicinal use. For example, lungwort, with its spotted leaves resembling diseased lungs, was used for respiratory ailments. Walnuts, looking like little brains, were thought to be good for head troubles. It's like nature left little visual clues, if only you knew how to read them. Sometimes it worked, sometimes... well, at least it probably didn't make things worse than the original illness. Then there are the remedies that sound downright bizarre, if not a little stomach-churning to modern ears. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from ancient Egypt we might have joked about in another context? Well, medieval remedies could get equally creative. Animal parts, bodily fluids, both human and animal, and various minerals were common ingredients. For a sore throat, you might be advised to wear a poultice of dung from a white dog. For epilepsy, some texts recommended drinking water from the skull of a suicide. It's a world where the line between medicine and what we'd consider magic or sheer desperation is very, very blurry. A mainstream historical fact: monasteries played a crucial role in preserving and practicing herbal medicine. Monks often cultivated extensive herb gardens, physic gardens, and copied ancient medical texts. While their understanding was based on humoral theory, the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile we touched on earlier, they accumulated a significant body of knowledge about the properties of various plants. This knowledge sometimes filtered out to lay healers. Alongside herbal remedies, healing practices often involved charms, prayers, or rituals. The wise woman might mutter specific words while applying a poultice or tie a knotted cord around an afflicted limb while reciting a charm. This wasn't necessarily seen as contradicting Christian belief. Rather, it was often viewed as invoking God's power through specific traditional means, or tapping into the natural God-given virtues of plants and words. The distinction between prayer and a magical incantation could be very fine indeed. Historians still argue whether these folk healers were universally respected, or if they always walked a fine line, their skills valued in times of need but potentially viewed with suspicion if things went wrong, or if their knowledge seemed too uncanny. If a remedy worked, the healer was praised. If it failed, or if the patient died, which given the state of medical knowledge happened often, it could sometimes lead to grumbling, or worse, accusations that the healer had perhaps used their knowledge for harm rather than good. This is a crucial point. These same skills that made someone a valued healer could, under different circumstances, make them a target. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval medical advice was surprisingly practical, even if the reasoning behind it was off. For example, the Anglo-Saxon Leech Book of Bald, a 10th century medical text, contains a recipe for an eye salve to treat a sty which they called a wen, made from garlic, onion or leek, wine, and ox gall, bile from a cow's stomach, brewed in a brass vessel and left to stand for 9 days. Modern scientific research at the University of Nottingham actually recreated this recipe and found it to be remarkably effective against methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, Asraceae, a nasty modern superbug. Sometimes, ancient wisdom, even if it sounds a bit like a witch's brew, had something going for it. It makes you wonder what other effective treatments were dismissed as mere folklore. So, you learn to navigate this world of healing. You learn which berries are safe to eat, and which will give you a terrible stomachache, or worse. You learn who to go to in the village when your child has a raging fever, or when a cut on your hand becomes infected. You might even pick up some basic knowledge of herbs yourself, just for everyday scrapes and coughs. It's a healthcare system born of necessity, a blend of empirical observation, ancient tradition, and a hefty dose of faith. Faith in the herbs, faith in the healer, and faith that whatever ails you won't be fatal. This knowledge of herbs and healing, this ability to ease suffering and perhaps even save a life, is a valuable skill in your community. It brings a certain respect, a certain reliance from your neighbours, but it's a double-edged sword. In a world where misfortune is often attributed to unseen forces, and where the line between beneficial white magic and malevolent black magic is dangerously thin, being too good at healing, or possessing knowledge that others don't understand, could eventually attract the wrong kind of attention. For now, you're grateful for the relief a simple herbal tea can bring, unaware that this very knowledge might one day be twisted into something sinister. Life in your medieval village trundles along, a predictable rhythm of seasons, labour, and simple routines. You're accustomed to the hardships, the smells, the lack of privacy. You know your place, you say your prayers, and you even know which herbs might soothe your aching back after a day in the fields. But human nature being what it is, even in the most tightly knit communities, friction occurs. Tempers flare, jealousy simmer, and small disputes can escalate. And in this world so deeply steeped in superstition and fear of the unknown, these ordinary human fallings out can take a dangerous turn. Whispers, once started, can gather momentum, morphing innocent quirks or unfortunate coincidences into something far more menacing. Imagine this. You have a minor argument with your neighbour, perhaps over a wandering pig that's rooted up your precious turnip patch, or a dispute about whose turn it is to use the communal grinding stone. Harsh words are exchanged. In the heat of the moment, maybe you utter a frustrated curse, something like, "May your bread never rise," or "May your chickens get the pox." In your modern world, this is just letting off steam, a meaningless outburst. But here, in the medieval mindset where words are believed to have power and misfortune, is often seen as inflicted rather than accidental. Such an utterance can be remembered. It can be filed away. A few days later, your neighbour's bread indeed fails to rise, or his prize rooster suddenly keels over. Coincidence? Your 21st century brain says, of course, bad yeast, sick chicken, happens all the time. But your neighbour, already nursing a grudge from your argument, might start to wonder. He remembers your angry words. He shares his misfortune, and your curse, with a few other villagers over a pint of ale at the informal village gathering spot. Funny thing, he might say, "Old Agnes wished my chickens ill, and now look." It's a bit too much of a coincidence, don't you think? Or perhaps it's not a direct curse. Maybe you're that woman we just discussed, the one who knows a bit about herbs. You've successfully mended a few sick animals, helped deliver a healthy baby when another midwife struggled. Your skills are generally appreciated. But then, a child you attended falls gravely ill and dies, despite your best efforts. The grieving mother, distraught and looking for someone or something to blame, remembers you. She remembers the strange-smelling poultice you applied, the quiet words you muttered. Was it a remedy, or something else? In her grief and fear, suspicion can easily take root. Unusual skills or habits can also mark you. Perhaps you're a bit reclusive, preferring your own company to the boisterous village gatherings. Maybe you talk to your cat, not just a friendly hello, but long, involved conversations. And let's be honest, who among us hasn't had a detailed chat with their pet? Or perhaps you have a noticeable birthmark, a physical peculiarity that sets you apart. In a society that values conformity and is wary of anything outside the norm, being different can be a dangerous liability. These things, innocent in themselves, can become fodder for gossip for the slow, insidious labelling of someone as uncanny. A mainstream historical fact. Most early accusations of witchcraft, particularly before the large-scale witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries, though our focus is broadly medieval, these roots are deep, often stemmed from localised personal disputes. It was frequently a case of maleficium, causing harm by magical means. If someone suffered a misfortune, illness, dead livestock, crop failure, impotence, a difficult childbirth, shortly after a known quarrel or an encounter with a suspected individual, witchcraft might be blamed. It provided an explanation for the inexplicable and a target for anger and fear. The village is a small, enclosed world. Everyone knows everyone else's business or thinks they do. Secrets are hard to keep, and reputations, once tarnished, are difficult to restore. The gossip network is highly efficient, more so than any modern social media algorithm when it comes to spreading local news. A raised eyebrow here, a hushed conversation there, a pointed silence when you walk by. These are the subtle ways suspicion begins to build. It's like a game of telephone, where the message gets distorted and amplified with each retelling. "She looked at my cow funny, and then it went dry," becomes, "She has the evil eye and cursed my livelihood." Historians still argue about the precise psychological and social mechanisms that allowed neighbourly disputes to escalate into witchcraft accusations. Was it primarily driven by genuine fear of supernatural harm, economic anxieties, blaming someone for your financial losses, social tensions, or even a way for communities to enforce conformity and ostracise troublesome individuals? It was likely a potent cocktail of all these factors, varying from case to case. Consider the power dynamics. If you're an elderly woman, perhaps widowed and living alone, you might be more vulnerable. You lack the protection of a husband or adult sons. If you're a bit cantankerous or known for speaking your mind, you might rub people the wrong way. These are the individuals who often found themselves on the receiving end of accusations. It wasn't always the cackling hag stereotype from later fiction. It was often just someone marginalised, someone a bit off, someone who became a convenient scapegoat when things went wrong. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes the accusation wasn't even initially serious. It could start as a jest. a piece of malicious teasing. Oh, careful, don't cross old Marjorie, or she'll turn your milk sour. But if Marjorie is already a bit disliked, and if someone's milk does then turn sour, the joke can suddenly lose its humour and gain a sinister edge. Laughter can curdle into fear remarkably quickly when the underlying belief system supports the possibility of such magic. So, that spat over the turnips, that unfortunate turn of phrase, that successful healing that now looks a bit too convenient, or even just your preference for solitude, these are the seeds. They're watered by local gossip, fertilised by existing superstitions, and warmed by the anxieties of daily life. You might not even be aware of the whispers at first, but they are there, growing louder, more insistent. The looks you get from your neighbours become a little colder, a little more appraising. You start to feel a subtle shift in the way people interact with you. The social fabric of your small community, once a source of support, however meagre, begins to feel a little frayed around the edges where you stand. The transition from respected, or at least tolerated neighbour, to suspected malevolent force is often gradual, insidious, and terrifyingly easy if the conditions are right, and the whispers, once they reach a certain volume, are very hard to silence. The whispers have grown. That argument over the pig, the untimely death of a neighbour's prized rooster after your muttered frustration, or perhaps your knack for herbal remedies that now seems a little too potent. These small incidents have coalesced into a cloud of suspicion that hangs heavy over you. It's no longer just idle gossip. There's a new, sharper edge to the talk in the village, and unfortunately for you, this era is not without its guidebooks, for those looking to identify and prosecute individuals suspected of darker dealings. While the most infamous of these, the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, was published a bit later, in 1487, its roots and the attitudes it codified were already taking hold in the late medieval period, providing a terrifying framework for what might come next. Imagine a book not filled with comforting stories or useful farming tips, but with detailed instructions on how to identify, interrogate, and convict a witch. That's essentially what the Malleus Maleficarum was. Written by Heinrich Kramer, a German Dominican inquisitor, with some disputed level of contribution from Jacob Sprenger, it became a bestseller of its time, second only to the Bible for a period. It wasn't an official church doctrine in the way the Catechism was, and its authority was even debated by some theologians at the time, but its influence, particularly in secular courts and among local authorities eager for a how-to manual, was profound and devastating. It lent an air of scholarly, theological legitimacy to the persecution of supposed witches. This book, and others like it that drew on similar themes, laid out a grim worldview. It argued that witchcraft was not just a matter of simple folk magic or superstition, but a dangerous heresy involving a pact with the devil. Witches, according to these texts, renounced God, worshipped Satan, and were granted supernatural powers to inflict harm, maleficium, upon their neighbours. They could supposedly cause storms, blight crops, kill livestock, induce illness and impotence, and even fly through the air to attend secret nocturnal gatherings called sabbats, where they engaged in all sorts of unspeakable acts with demons. It's a far cry from just knowing which herbs soothe a cough, isn't it? The Malleus Maleficarum was particularly notorious for its misogyny. It dedicates significant portions to explaining why women were supposedly more susceptible to the devil's temptations than men. Kramer argued that women were more credulous, more impressionable, more lustful, and inherently weaker in faith and intellect. He even etymologically links femina, woman, to fe, faith, and minus, less, meaning lesser faith. It's a blatant, shocking piece of sexism, even by the standards of the time, and it had terrible consequences, as the vast majority of those accused and executed for witchcraft over the centuries were women. Suddenly, being a woman, especially an older, widowed or outspoken one, became a risk factor. So how would such a handbook help your accusers? It provided a checklist of suspicious behaviours and supposed signs of witchcraft. Did you fail to show appropriate grief at a funeral? Suspicious? Did you keep pets, especially a cat? Remember poor Tibbles, your chatty companion. That could be a familiar, a demonic spirit in animal form. Did you have an unusual mark on your body? A mole? A birthmark? Even an old scar? That could be a devil's mark, an insensitive spot where the devil had sealed his pact with you, supposedly impervious to pain. The search for such marks became a common and degrading part of witch trials. The book also offered advice on legal procedures, including how to interrogate suspects to elicit a confession. It recommended methods that, while not always explicitly advocating for the most brutal forms of torture, though it certainly didn't rule them out and acknowledge their utility, were designed to break a person's will. Prolonged questioning, sleep deprivation, leading questions, and the use of deception by interrogators. It suggested that if a suspected witch didn't weep under interrogation, it was a sure sign of guilt, as witches were supposedly unable to cry, unless they were crocodile tears, of course. It's a classic catch-22. Show emotion, you're hysterical and therefore suspicious. Show no emotion, you're unnaturally composed and therefore guilty. A mainstream historical fact, the Malleus Maleficarum, drew upon existing folklore, theological arguments about demonic power, and previous legal precedents regarding heresy and magic. It wasn't entirely novel, but it synthesized these elements into a comprehensive and chillingly practical guide that fueled the witch-hunting craze that would escalate in the centuries following its publication. Its impact was to systematize and intellectualize the persecution of witches, moving it from sporadic local accusations of harmful magic to a more organized hunt for organized, devil-worshipping heretics. Historians still argue about the precise extent of the Malleus Maleficarum's direct influence on every local trial, especially in the earlier period. Some suggest its impact is overstated, and that local customs and legal practices remained paramount. However, its wide dissemination undeniably contributed to a climate of fear, and provided a ready-made justification for authorities who were inclined to prosecute. It gave them a script to follow. Here's a quirky, or rather deeply disturbing tidbit from the era's thinking: the Malleus and similar texts often spent a great deal of time discussing the supposed sexual relations between witches and demons, incubi and succubi. It's a lurid, obsessive focus that reveals much about the anxieties and repressions of the time. The idea that you, as an accused witch, might be forced to confess to such fantastical and degrading acts under duress is a horrifying prospect. Imagine trying to explain to your interrogators, who are armed with this book, that no, you haven't been cavorting with demons, you were just trying to make a poultice for Mrs. Gable's gout. So, while you may not know the specific title, Malleus Maleficarum, the ideas it contains are beginning to seep into the consciousness of those around you, or at least into the minds of those in positions of authority who might eventually hear your case. The local priest might have heard of such writings, or a travelling magistrate might carry a copy. The fear of an organised, diabolical conspiracy of witches is starting to take root, adding a terrifying new dimension to the simple fear of someone causing your cow to go dry. It means that if you are formally accused, you're not just being accused of being a bad neighbour, you're potentially being accused of being an enemy of God and humanity, a soldier in Satan's army. The stakes have just been raised, terrifyingly so. The whispers are no longer just whispers, they're starting to sound like an indictment. The shadow of suspicion, once a faint outline, is now stark and chilling. The theoretical framework for identifying a witch, perhaps influenced by terrifying texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, or similar prevailing attitudes, is no longer just an abstract concept for the learned or the overly zealous. It's beginning to manifest in the way your community, the people you've lived alongside your entire life, now look at you. They are watching you, and every little thing you do or don't do is being scrutinised, catalogued, and potentially misinterpreted through a new sinister lens. Your ordinary life is becoming a collection of evidence against you. It starts subtly. You notice that conversations hush when you approach the village well. Children who once played near your cottage are now quickly shooed away by their mothers. Your usual trading partners for a bit of extra flour or some mending work suddenly find excuses. They're all stocked up, or they've found someone else. The easy camaraderie you once shared, however thin it might have been in this harsh life, is evaporating, replaced by a wary distance. It's an unnerving, isolating experience. You feel like you have a spotlight on you, but it's not the warm glow of acceptance. It's the cold, searching beam of suspicion. Remember that birthmark on your arm, the one you've had your whole life? Suddenly it's not just a birthmark, people eye it furtively. Whispers might circulate that it's a witch's mark or a devil's teat, a spot where your supposed demonic familiar, that cat you talk to perhaps, suckles. It's a grotesque thought, turning something mundane into a sign of diabolical allegiance. You might try to cover it, but the very act of concealment could be seen as further proof of guilt. Your knowledge of herbs, once a source of help and perhaps a little income, now works against you. If someone you treated recovered, it might be grudgingly accepted, but if they didn't, or if their recovery was slow, or if someone saw Elst or fell ill shortly after you were seen gathering plants by the stream, the connection is made. She was collecting strange roots just last week, and now look at poor Thomas's boy struck down with a fever. The fact that you are probably collecting yarrow to stop bleeding or chamomile for a calming tea is irrelevant. In the eyes of the fearful, your herbal lore becomes evidence of trafficking in dangerous, unnatural substances. Even your piety or perceived lack thereof is under the microscope. Do you attend church regularly? If you miss a service, perhaps due to illness or the pressing need to tend your meagre crops, it's noted. Do you seem distracted during Mass? Perhaps you're not praying to God, but to someone else. Do you look the priest in the eye? If you do, you're brazen. If you don't, you're shifty and hiding something. It's a classic no-win situation, a psychological trap where any behaviour can be twisted to fit the accuser's narrative. Unfortunate coincidences become damning evidence. A hailstorm damages the crops in the village fields, but your little patch of cabbages seems slightly less affected. Are you just lucky, or did you use your nefarious powers to protect your own while blighting your neighbours? Your cow gives more milk than anyone else's. Is it good animal husbandry, or did you magically steal the milk from other cows in the village? This latter belief, that witches could magically draw milk from their neighbours' animals, was a surprisingly common accusation, known as milk stealing. It sounds almost comical now, but it was a serious charge, reflecting deep anxieties about livelihood and sustenance. A mainstream historical fact, spectral evidence played a role in some witch trials, particularly later in places like Salem. This referred to testimony by accusers that they had been tormented or attacked by the apparition, or spirit of the accused, even if the accused was physically elsewhere at the time. While its acceptance varied, the very idea that someone could be accused based on what another person dreamed or imagined shows how far removed from normal standards of evidence these proceedings could be. Even if not formally accepted in your local manor court, the power of such claims in the court of public opinion could be devastating. The way you react to the growing suspicion also becomes part of the proof. If you become withdrawn and fearful, it's because you have a guilty conscience. If you try to defend yourself, to explain the misunderstandings, you're being argumentative and uncooperative, trying to bewitch your accusers with clever words. If you get angry and curse the injustice of it all, well, that just confirms your malevolent nature. Your every emotional response is filtered through the presumption of guilt. Historians still argue about the role of collective hysteria in these situations. How much of it was genuine, widespread fear, and how much was driven by a few influential individuals or specific social pressures within the community? It's likely a complex interplay. Fear is contagious, and once a narrative of witchcraft takes hold, it can be hard to dislodge, especially when it offers a convenient explanation for hardship and misfortune. Here's a quirky and rather sad tidbit. Sometimes, accusations could stem from what we might now recognise as mental illness or dementia in the accused. An elderly woman exhibiting confusion, muttering to herself, or behaving erratically could easily be misinterpreted as communing with spirits or showing signs of demonic influence. In an age without psychiatric understanding, such behaviours were frightening and easily fit into the witchcraft paradigm. Your social circle shrinks to almost nothing. People avoid your gaze. If you try to join a group, they fall silent or find reasons to disperse. The isolation is profound, a form of social death that precedes any formal accusation. You're being judged, tried and convicted in the minds of your neighbours, long before any official process begins. They are looking for confirmation of what they already know to be true, that you are different, that you are dangerous, that you are, somehow, the cause of their troubles. You feel their eyes on your back as you walk through the village. You hear the sudden silence that falls when you enter the small space where villagers gather. You see the way they pull their children closer, the way they might make a subtle sign of the cross or touch a hidden amulet when you pass. These are not just isolated incidents anymore. They're a pattern, a tightening net of suspicion. You're being watched, yes, but more than that, you're being defined by their fear. And that definition, in this anxious age, is rapidly solidifying into one word: witch. The weight of communal suspicion has become almost unbearable. The averted gazes, the hushed conversations, the shrinking away of those you once considered neighbours. It's all culminated in an atmosphere thick with unspoken accusation. And then, it happens. The whispers, the pointing fingers, the collective fear and anger finally boil over into a formal denunciation. Perhaps it's your aggrieved neighbour, still smarting over that dead rooster and convinced of your malevolent intent. Maybe it's a group of villagers who have compiled a list of misfortunes they now attribute to you. Or perhaps it's the local priest swayed by the mounting gossip and his own anxieties about an unholy influence in his flock. However it comes, the moment is terrifying. You're officially accused, and your horrifying journey through the medieval justice system begins. There's no turning back now. The accusation might be delivered formally, with a summons to appear before the manor court, presided over by the lord of the manor or his steward. Or it could be more direct, more brutal. A group of villagers, perhaps emboldened by ale and fear, arriving at your humble hut. Their faces grim, their voices laced with accusation. They might drag you from your home, your protests and pleas for reason lost in the swell of their certainty. Your fear is immense, a cold dread that seeps into your bones, far colder than any pre-dawn chill you've experienced. There's no Miranda warning here, no right to remain silent or consult with a lawyer. The concept of a defense attorney for a peasant accused of witchcraft is anachronistic. You are presumed guilty, or at least highly suspect, from the outset. The burden of proof is effectively reversed. It's up to you to prove your innocence against a tide of fear, superstition, and quite possibly outright malice. And how do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate you didn't curse the crops or cause that illness, especially when your accusers are convinced you did? You might be brought before the manor court, a relatively local affair. Here the evidence against you will be presented. This won't be forensic evidence or carefully cross-examined witness testimony in the modern sense. It will be a collection of anecdotes, rumours and misfortunes linked to you by association and suspicion. Goodman Giles's cow went dry the day after she scowled at it. Mistress Ilara's child fell sick after she gave it an apple. She was seen muttering strange words over a bundle of herbs by the light of the full moon. Remember all those little things, those coincidences and misinterpreted actions? They are now laid out as a damning indictment. Your accusers will speak with conviction, their fear and anger palpable. Your denials, however vehement, may sound hollow against their emotionally charged testimony. You might try to reason with them, to explain the misunderstandings, but in this atmosphere, reason is a fragile defence. They are not looking for logical explanations. They are looking for confirmation of their fears. They need you to be the witch, because that gives them a tangible cause for their suffering, a target for their anxieties. A mainstream historical fact. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly for accusations of maleficium, harmful magic, local secular or manorial courts often handled the initial proceedings. The procedures varied greatly. Sometimes a system of compurgation might be used, where the accused could be acquitted if they could find a certain number of oath helpers, reputable members of the community willing to swear to their good character. However, if suspicion against you is already widespread, finding enough people willing to risk their own reputations by vouching for a suspected witch would be incredibly difficult. Who would want to associate themselves with you now? Depending on the severity of the accusations and the prevailing local attitudes, and whether there's a zealous authority figure involved who has read something like the Malleus Maleficarum, your case might attract the attention of higher authorities, perhaps even ecclesiastical, church officials, especially if the charges escalate beyond simple harmful magic to accusations of heresy, diabolism, and a pact with the devil. This is when things can get even more dangerous, as the focus shifts from compensating for alleged damages to rooting out a perceived threat to God and society. You might be imprisoned pending further investigation or trial, and medieval prisons are not the relatively regulated institutions of today. You could be thrown into a dark, damp, filthy cell, perhaps a tower room in the local lord's castle, or a squalid village lockup. Food and water would be meagre, sanitation non-existent. You'd be cold, hungry, terrified, and utterly alone with your thoughts and your fear. The isolation itself is a form of torment. Historians still argue about the degree to which accused witches believed in their own powers, or the reality of witchcraft as defined by their accusers. While some cunning folk certainly believed they could perform beneficial magic, It's highly unlikely that many of those accused of diabolical witchcraft actually thought they had pacts with Satan or flew to sabbats. The charges were often so fantastical that the accused must have been bewildered and horrified by what they were hearing. Here's a quirky or rather grim detail about the process. The swimming test, or ordeal by cold water, was a method sometimes used to determine guilt, though its legality and application varied, and it became more common in later periods. The accused would be bound, often thumb to opposite toe, and thrown into a body of consecrated water. If they floated, it was seen as a sign that the holy water was rejecting them, thus proving their guilt as a witch. If they sank, they were considered innocent, though they might drown in the process of proving it. This logic was based on the idea that witches, having renounced their baptism, were repelled by blessed water. It's a terrifying example of a no-win situation, dressed up as divine judgment. The formal accusation is a point of no return. Your name is now officially linked with the darkest of suspicions. Your family, if you have one, will be shamed and possibly ostracized. Your friends, if any remain, will be powerless to help, or too scared to try. The weight of the community, the law, and often the church is now pressing down on you. You are caught in the terrifying gears of a system that is not designed to find truth in the way you understand it, but to identify and neutralize a perceived threat. The initial shock of the accusation gives way to a dawning, horrifying realization. Your life is no longer your own. It is in the hands of people who believe you are capable of monstrous things, and they will use the means at their disposal to prove it. The path ahead is dark and the prospects are grim. The accusations have been made, and you're now ensnared in the terrifying machinery of medieval justice. Perhaps you've endured a period of miserable imprisonment, your spirit already frayed by fear and isolation. Now, you might face a procedure that seems utterly alien to your modern sensibilities, the trial by ordeal. In a world where concrete evidence for witchcraft is, by its very nature, elusive, how do you prove someone flew on a broomstick or conversed with demons? Authorities sometimes turned to what they believed was divine intervention to determine guilt or innocence. God, it was thought, would protect the innocent and expose the guilty. It's a terrifying prospect, placing your fate not in the hands of reasoned judgment, but in a direct physical test supposedly adjudicated by the Almighty himself. Trial by ordeal had ancient roots, predating Christianity but later adapted and sanctioned by the Church for a time, though its official approval waned by the early 13th century. However, the practice persisted in various forms in folk justice, and even some secular courts, especially when other forms of evidence were lacking. For a peasant accused of a crime as nebulous and feared as witchcraft, where witness testimony was often based on superstition and personal animosity, an ordeal might have seemed like a direct line to a definitive divinely ordained verdict. Several forms of ordeal existed. One common method was the ordeal of hot iron. You would be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a set distance, perhaps 9 paces. Your hand would then be bandaged and sealed. After 3 days, the bandage would be removed in the presence of a priest or official. If the wound was healing cleanly, it was a sign from God that you were innocent. If it was festering and infected, which given the general lack of hygiene and understanding of infection, was highly likely regardless of guilt, you were deemed guilty. Imagine the searing pain, the smell of burning flesh, and then the agonizing 3-day wait, knowing your fate hung on the unpredictable nature of wound healing in an unhygienic era. It's less a test of guilt, and more a test of your body's ability to fight off massive infection under terrible conditions. Another form was the ordeal of hot water. You'd have to plunge your arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or a ring. Again, your arm would be bandaged, and the outcome judged by the state of the wound after 3 days. The principle was the same: divine protection for the innocent, festering proof of guilt for the wicked. The chances of emerging unscathed from such a test were, to put it mildly, slim. It makes you wonder if anyone ever passed these tests, or if the expectation was so heavily skewed towards a guilty outcome based on the inevitable injury. Then there was the ordeal of cold water, which we touched upon earlier, the infamous swimming test. You would be bound, often right thumb to left big toe and left thumb to right big toe, creating a contorted, helpless posture. You'd then be lowered into a pond or river that had been blessed by a priest. The theory was that water, being a pure element and used in baptism, would reject a witch who had supposedly renounced their Christian faith. Therefore, if you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent. The cruel irony, of course, was that sinking often meant drowning, unless you were pulled out very quickly. It's a horrifying catch. 22. Float and be condemned as a witch. Sink and potentially die, proving your innocence. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of the swimming test was genuinely seen as a divine judgment, or if it was more a form of public shaming and a way to force a de facto confession or resolution when other evidence was weak. A mainstream historical fact. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, a hugely influential church council convened by Pope Innocent III, formally forbade clergy from participating in or blessing trials by ordeal. This was a significant turning point, as it removed the church's official sanction and led to a gradual decline in the use of ordeals in formal legal systems, particularly in England and parts of France, where jury trials began to develop more robustly. However, the decline was slow, and the appeal of such divine judgments lingered, especially in more remote areas or in cases of suspected witchcraft where rational proof was hard to come by. The idea that God would directly intervene was a powerful one. These ordeals were highly ritualized events, often preceded by fasting, prayer, and religious ceremonies. This was meant to emphasize the solemnity of the occasion and the belief that God was indeed overseeing the proceedings. For you, the accused, it would be a terrifying public spectacle. The entire village might turn out to watch, their faces a mixture of fear, anticipation, and morbid curiosity. There would be no sympathy, only judgment in their eyes. You are the focus of a divine drama, and the script feels heavily weighted against you. Quirky tidbit. Sometimes the ordeal of the morsel, or cursed morsel, korsned, was used. The accused was given a small piece of bread, often consecrated bread, to the host, or cheese. They had to swallow it while praying that they would choke on it if guilty. If they choked or had difficulty swallowing, it was taken as a sign of guilt. It's a psychological test as much as anything. Imagine trying to swallow dry bread when you're terrified and your mouth is parched with fear. It plays on the body's involuntary reactions to extreme stress. Facing an ordeal, your mind would be a whirl of terror. The physical pain would be immense, but perhaps even worse would be the psychological torment. Your life, your reputation, your very soul feels like it's balanced on a razor's edge, dependent on an outcome you cannot control, interpreted by people who are already inclined to believe the worst of you. There is no room for logic, for evidence, for a reasoned defence. There is only the hot iron, the boiling water, the cold pond, and the supposed will of God. If you failed the ordeal, as was overwhelmingly likely, it was seen as irrefutable proof of your guilt. God himself had spoken. This would pave the way for your sentencing, which, for witchcraft, could be severe. If, by some miracle, your wound healed cleanly, or you managed to sink without drowning and were pulled out in time, it might lead to your release, but you would likely still carry the stigma of the accusation. The suspicion might linger. The ordeal system, from your modern perspective, is a horrifying example of justice delegated to chance and superstition, a system almost designed to confirm guilt rather than ascertain truth. As you stand there, awaiting your turn with the hot iron or the noose that will lower you into the water, you realise just how far you are from any concept of justice you once knew. This is a raw, terrifying appeal to a supernatural referee, and the rules of the game are entirely outside your comprehension or control. Perhaps you've failed an ordeal, the festering wound on your hand or your unfortunate buoyancy in the village pond sealing your fate in the eyes of your accusers. Or maybe the ordeal system has fallen out of favour in your particular region, or the charges against you are deemed so severe, perhaps escalating to diabolical pacts rather than just curdling milk, that a more thorough investigation is required. This is where you might enter the even more terrifying realm of formal interrogation, a process designed not so much to discover truth as to extract a confession, often using methods that carefully, insidiously break your will. Let's be clear. While the most extreme and lurid depictions of torture chambers filled with elaborate devices belong more to the height of the witch hunts in later centuries, the medieval period was certainly no stranger to coercive methods in legal proceedings, especially for serious crimes or when dealing with those perceived as obstinate or dangerous. The line between rigorous questioning and outright psychological, and sometimes physical torment could be very thin indeed. The key here is carefully. The aim is to get you to speak the words they want to hear, to confirm their suspicions, to validate the entire process. You're likely already weakened and demoralised from imprisonment, poor food, and the constant fear. Now you face your interrogators. These might be local magistrates, church officials if heresy is suspected, or even specially appointed inquisitors in some regions and times. They are figures of authority, often learned or believing themselves to be so, and utterly convinced of the reality of witchcraft and increasingly your guilt. They may genuinely believe they are doing God's work, saving your soul by forcing a confession, even if it means breaking your body or mind in the process. The interrogation might begin with leading questions designed to trap you. When did you first meet the devil? Not, did you ever meet the devil? How many other witches were at the Sabbat you attended in the woods last Walpurgisnacht? Not, did you attend such a gathering? Your denials are dismissed as lies, as the obstinacy of a hardened sinner. The Malleus Maleficarum, remember, offered guidance on this, suggesting that witches were notoriously deceitful and would deny their guilt to the very end unless compelled. Sleep deprivation is a powerful tool. You might be kept awake for days on end, questioned relentlessly. Your cell might be deliberately uncomfortable, cold, damp, perhaps with sharp stones on the floor, making rest impossible. Guards might be instructed to make noise, to constantly disturb you. After days without sleep, your mind becomes clouded, your judgment impaired, your ability to resist suggestion severely diminished. You become disoriented, desperate for any respite. This, in itself, is a form of torture, invisible but incredibly effective. Prolonged standing or being forced into uncomfortable positions, known as strafbank, or stress positions in later contexts, could also be used. Imagine being forced to stand for hours, or to hold your arms outstretched until your muscles scream in agony. This doesn't necessarily leave visible marks like a whip would, but it's incredibly painful and psychologically wearing. The interrogators might use psychological tactics. They might feign sympathy, offering you an easy way out if you just confess to some minor charges, only to use that admission as leverage for more serious accusations. They might bring in other witnesses, perhaps people you know who have been pressured or tricked into testifying against you, to increase your sense of hopelessness and isolation. They might play good cop, bad cop, one interrogator, screaming accusations and threats, the other offering kindness and the promise of leniency if you cooperate. It's a disorienting, manipulative dance, a mainstream historical fact. The use of judicial torture to extract confessions became more formalised in continental European legal systems from the 13th century onwards, particularly with the revival of Roman law. While its application varied, and in England it was technically not part of common law procedure, though it occurred under royal warrant in some cases, the principle that a confession was the queen of proofs was widespread. If a witch confessed, the case was essentially closed. Therefore, immense pressure was put on obtaining that confession. The search for the devil's mark we mentioned earlier could also be part of this process. You might be stripped and minutely examined, often by a witch pricker, for any unusual blemishes, moles or scars. These spots would then be pricked with a needle or bodkin. If the spot didn't bleed, or if you didn't show pain, perhaps because the pricker cleverly used a retractable blade, or simply because repeated prodding numbed the area, it was declared a devil's mark, proof of your pact. This was a humiliating and terrifying experience, designed to degrade you and provide further evidence of your guilt. Historians still argue about the extent to which interrogators genuinely believed in the elaborate diabolical conspiracies they were often trying to uncover, versus the extent to which confessions were essentially scripted and fed to the exhausted and terrified accused. It's probable that many interrogators were true believers in the reality of satanic witchcraft, as described in texts like the Malleus, and saw it as their duty to root it out, using whatever means necessary. Here's a quirky, or rather deeply disturbing tidbit about interrogation. Sometimes the very silence of the accused was taken as a sign of guilt, attributed to a demonic pact of muteness. Or, if the accused spoke too eloquently in their own defence, it could be twisted into evidence that the devil was giving them clever words to deceive the court. The trap was perfectly set. Damned if you do, damned if you don't speak, damned if you speak too well or too little. Food and water might be restricted, further weakening your resolve. You're completely at their mercy, cut off from any support, your body aching, your mind reeling from exhaustion and fear. The questions keep coming, the accusations relentless. They might describe lurid details of sabbats, of flying ointments, of kissing the devil's rump, and demand that you confirm your participation. The pressure to simply make it stop, to say anything that will grant you a moment's peace, even if it's a lie, becomes immense. This isn't about a fair investigation. It's about a predetermined outcome. They are not looking for your truth. They are looking for their truth to be voiced through your mouth. And as the hours or days of this relentless pressure wear on, your ability to hold on to your own reality, your own innocence, begins to crumble. The goal is to break your will, carefully, systematically, until you are ready to say whatever they want to hear. And for many that breaking point tragically would eventually come. You recount details of these sabbats, the feasting, though, ironically, the food was often described in confessions as tasteless or disgusting, hardly a selling point for eternal damnation. The wild, sacrilegious dancing, the parody of Christian rites, and the solemn worship of Satan, who might be seated on a black throne. It's all so vivid in their descriptions, so grotesquely imaginative, that repeating it feels like narrating a particularly grim fairy tale. You might even find yourself adding small details, embellishments born of a desperate attempt to sound convincing, to give them what they so clearly crave. The devil's organisational skills for these supposed mass gatherings must have been top-notch given the logistics of flying everyone in on time. Then comes the maleficium, the harmful magic. Yes, you confess to causing Goodman Giles's cow to go dry. You explain how you did it, perhaps by muttering a specific charm you now invent, or by using a poppet, a small doll representing the victim that you never actually possessed. Yes, you admit to blighting your neighbour's crops out of spite, using powders and incantations whispered to you by your demonic master. You might even take responsibility for illnesses or accidents that occurred in the village, things you had absolutely no connection to, but which now, in this twisted narrative, become your doing. Each admission is another nail in your own coffin, another thread in the tapestry of lies they are weaving around you. Perhaps the most agonizing part is when they pressure you to name others. Who else was at the Sabbat? Who are your fellow witches in this village? This was a common and devastating feature of witch trials. Under duress, desperate to appease their interrogators, or perhaps vainly hoping for some leniency, many accused individuals implicated others, friends, neighbours, even family members. The interrogators might suggest names, people already under suspicion, making it easier for you to just nod to agree. The guilt of this, of potentially condemning another innocent person to the same fate, would be a heavy burden, even in your broken state. It's like being forced to pull someone else into the quicksand with you, just to get a moment's breath. You confirm the existence of your familiar, that demonic spirit in animal form. Perhaps it was your cat Tibbles after all, or maybe a toad, a dog, or some other creature. You describe how it advised you, how you fed it, sometimes with your own blood, from that devil's mark they were so keen to find. Yes, you admit the mark is there, given to you by the devil as a sign of your pact, and yes, it's insensitive to pain, because by now, you're probably so numb with terror and exhaustion, you'd barely feel a thing anyway, or they've already found it and declared it so. A mainstream historical fact is that once a confession was obtained, especially one detailing a pact with the devil and participation in sabbats, it was considered the queen of proofs, and made conviction almost certain. These confessions, often extracted under duress or torture, were meticulously recorded and read out in court, providing powerful, albeit entirely fabricated evidence. The words pour out of you, a torrent of fabricated sins. You describe impossible acts, grotesque allegiances, and a betrayal of everything you once held dear. Each sentence feels like a betrayal of your own soul, but the alternative, the continuation of the interrogation, the endless pain and fear seems even more unbearable. You're no longer yourself. You're a mouthpiece for their fears, their theology, their need for a scapegoat. You might even feel a strange sense of detachment, as if watching someone else speak these terrible things. It's the only way to cope with the horror of what you're being forced to do. Historians still argue whether individuals who confessed under such extreme pressure ever came to believe, even partially, in the fantasies they were forced to articulate, or if it was purely a survival mechanism. Did some, in their broken state, begin to internalize the guilt, to wonder if perhaps they had somehow unknowingly done these things given the overwhelming certainty of their accusers? It's a chilling thought. As you speak, you might notice a grim satisfaction on the faces of your interrogators. They're getting what they wanted. Your confession validates their beliefs, justifies their methods, and confirms their worldview. They are the heroes, rooting out evil, and you are the villain, finally unmasked. It's a strange sort of relief almost to see that look, because it means the immediate pressure might lessen, even if the long-term consequences are catastrophic. Maybe they'll finally let you sleep, or give you a sip of water that doesn't taste of mildew. Small mercies in a landscape of utter despair. Here's a quirky, or rather deeply unsettling aspect of some recorded confessions. The sheer banality of evil mixed with the fantastical. Some confessions included details about the devil having cold hands, or complaining about the poor quality of the wine at the Sabbat. It's these little humanizing, if one can use that word for a demon, or mundane details, likely suggested or fabricated, that made the confession seem more real to those listening, even amidst the impossible claims of flying and transvection. It's like they were trying to make the devil relatable, in a terrifyingly twisted way, a sort of Satan. He's just like us, but with more brimstone and fewer scruples. By the time your confession is complete, you're an empty shell. You've given them everything they wanted, and in doing so, you've sealed your own doom. The words you spoke, words you never meant, will be recorded, read out, and used against you with the full force of whatever law, secular or ecclesiastical, governs your fate. You have confessed to being a witch, an enemy of God and humanity. There is little hope left now, only the terrifying anticipation of what comes next. The relief of the confession ending is fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold, hard dread of the inevitable sentence. Your confession, a tapestry woven from exhaustion, fear, and the insidious suggestions of your interrogators, now hangs in the air, heavy and damning. The words you were forced to utter, detailing impossible pacts with the devil, spectral flights to unholy sabbats, and a litany of malevolent acts against your neighbours, have been meticulously recorded. There's a grim finality to it. The interrogation is over, but your ordeal is far from finished. Now comes the inevitable consequence, the sentence. Whether you're brought before a formal court, be it the local manor court now armed with your devastating confession, or a more imposing ecclesiastical or secular tribunal, the outcome is almost a foregone conclusion. Your confession is the queen of proofs, as we've noted. It trumps any lingering doubts, any pleas of coercion, which would likely be dismissed as further evidence of your deceitfulness. The atmosphere in the courtroom, or whatever space serves as one, is not one of impartial justice, but of condemnation. The faces of the judges, the clerk, even the spectators, reflect a mixture of fear, righteous anger, and a grim satisfaction that a dangerous enemy has been unmasked. The charges are read out, a formal litany of your supposed crimes against God and community. They will likely highlight the most sensational aspects of your confession, your renunciation of faith, your worship of Satan, your attendance at Sabbats, and the specific acts of maleficium you admitted to, the blighted crops, the sickened livestock, the unexplained illnesses. Each charge is a hammer blow, reinforcing the narrative of your monstrous guilt. You stand there, probably still weak, dishevelled and emotionally shattered, a pariah in your own community. You may be asked if you have anything to say before sentence is passed. What can you say? If you try to retract your confession, to explain the circumstances under which it was given, the sleep deprivation, the threats, the leading questions, you'll likely be accused of being an unrepentant liar, further hardened in your wickedness, the Malleus Maleficarum. And similar texts warned that witches were notoriously slippery and would try to recant. Your interrogators might even have threatened you with further torment if you dared to change your story now. So you might just stand there in silence, a broken figure, the fight gone out of you. Or perhaps you'll whisper a plea for mercy, a faint hope against overwhelming odds. A mainstream historical fact. The penalties for witchcraft varied depending on the time, place, and the specific nature of the charges. If the accusation was primarily for maleficium, causing harm, without the explicit charge of a diabolical pact, the sentence in some earlier or more lenient jurisdictions might be banishment, public penance, or imprisonment. However, once witchcraft was firmly linked with heresy and devil worship, as it increasingly was in the period influenced by texts like the Malleus, it became a capital crime in most of Europe. The reasoning was that if heresy, a crime against God, was punishable by death, then witchcraft, seen as the ultimate heresy, certainly warranted the same. The judge or panel of judges will confer, though their deliberation is likely brief. The evidence, your own damning words, is overwhelming in their eyes. Then the sentence is pronounced. In many cases, particularly if you've confessed to a pact with the devil and attendance at sabbats, the verdict will be death. There's a chilling finality to the words, often delivered with solemn religious justifications. You're being removed from the community to protect others, and perhaps, in some twisted logic, even to save your soul from further damnation by cutting short. Your earthly transgressions is like a surgeon cutting off a supposedly gangrenous limb to save the body, only you're the limb. The method of execution also varied. In England and its American colonies, hanging was the common method for convicted witches, as witchcraft was typically tried in secular courts as a felony. However, on the European continent, where witchcraft was often treated as heresy and dealt with by ecclesiastical or secular courts applying Roman law principles, burning at the stake was a frequent punishment. Burning was seen as a way to purify the witch's soul and to utterly destroy their physical body, preventing any lingering evil or even the chance of their remains being used for nefarious purposes. The symbolism was potent and horrific. Imagine hearing those words. You are sentenced to be burned at the stake until you are dead, or you shall be hanged by the neck until dead. The world around you might seem to tilt, the voices fading into a dull roar. The terror is absolute, a cold, sickening wave that washes over you. There is no appeal to a higher court that would reconsider the evidence. There is no human rights organisation to protest your treatment. This is it. Your coerced confession has led directly to this moment, this irrevocable pronouncement of your doom. Historians still argue about the mindset of those passing these sentences. Were they all cynical manipulators, or were many of them genuinely convinced they were acting justly and protecting society from a real and present demonic threat? The prevailing belief systems of the era, the fear of chaos, and the theological frameworks all contributed to an environment where such sentences could be delivered with a sense of profound, albeit horrifyingly misguided, righteousness. Here's a quirky, or rather utterly tragic tidbit. Sometimes, if a condemned witch was deemed repentant, often meaning they upheld their confession and perhaps even implicated others, they might be granted the mercy of being strangled or garroted by the executioner just before the flames were lit, as a way to lessen their suffering. This was considered an act of clemency. The idea that being strangled before being burned alive could be seen as merciful speaks volumes about the brutality of the system. It's a grim sort of compassion, like offering someone a slightly smaller hammer to hit their thumb with. After the sentence, you are returned to your cell, or perhaps a condemned hold, to await your execution. The waiting is its own form of torture. Every creak of the door, every footstep in the corridor could be the sound of your executioners arriving. You might be visited by a priest, urging you to make a final, sincere repentance, to save your soul even if your body is forfeit. Your family, if they are brave enough to risk association, might be allowed a final, heartbreaking visit. But mostly, you are alone with your terror and the knowledge of your impending agonizing death. A death brought about by words you never meant, for crimes you never committed. The medieval justice system, having extracted its confession, is now ready to deliver its ultimate terrible punishment. The final act of this tragedy is about to begin. While you've been navigating the terrifying labyrinth of witchcraft accusations, a far more indiscriminate killer stalks the medieval world, one that doesn't require a coerced confession or a trial by ordeal to claim its victims. This is the ever-present threat of deadly disease, most notoriously the plague, but also a host of other ailments that could sweep through a village or town with devastating speed and ferocity. Your chances of surviving a day, let alone a lifetime, are constantly challenged not just by human cruelty or superstition, but by the microscopic enemies against which you have almost no defence. Imagine the sudden onset. One day you feel perfectly fine, or as fine as a hard-working, undernourished medieval peasant can feel. The next, you're struck by a raging fever, chills that shake your whole body, and excruciating aches in your limbs. Perhaps painful swellings or buboes appear in your groin, armpits, or neck, the telltale sign of bubonic plague. There's no understanding of germ theory here, no antibiotics, no public health initiatives in the modern sense. Illness is often attributed to a miasma, bad air, an imbalance of the humours, divine punishment for sin, or, as we've seen, the malevolent actions of witches. The Black Death, which swept through Europe from 1347 to 1351, was the most catastrophic pandemic in recorded history. A mainstream historical fact, it's estimated to have killed anywhere from 30% to 60% of Europe's population. Imagine 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you know dying within a few short years. Villages were depopulated, fields left untended, social structures thrown into chaos. The sheer scale of death is almost unimaginable, and this wasn't a one-time event. Plague recurred in waves for centuries, a constant shadow hanging over medieval and early modern life. So even if you dodge the witch hunter, you might not dodge Yersinia pestis. When plague, or another virulent disease like smallpox, dysentery, the bloody flux, typhus, jail fever, or influenza strikes your village, fear is instantaneous and overwhelming. People would try desperate measures to ward it off. They might burn aromatic herbs like rosemary or juniper to purify the air, though this did little against flea-borne or contagiously spread diseases. They'd ring church bells, hoping the sound would drive away the pestilence. Processions and public prayers would be held, imploring God for mercy. Some might flee to the countryside if they lived in a town or try to isolate their village, though often it was too late. If someone in your household falls ill, the sense of dread is immense. You might try the local herbwoman's remedies, as we discussed, some of which might offer symptomatic relief, but none could cure these killer diseases. The priest might come to offer last rites, but even he might be hesitant for fear of contagion. Often, the sick were isolated, sometimes forcibly. Houses with plague victims might be marked with a cross and quarantined. The inhabitants, sick and healthy alike, sealed inside to die or survive as best they could. It's a brutal form of public health, born of terror. Care for the sick was rudimentary and fraught with danger for the caregiver. You'd try to keep them comfortable, offer water, wipe their fevered brow, all the while knowing you were exposing yourself to the same deadly illness. Watching a loved one suffer an agonizing death from plague, the high fever, the delirium, the painful buboes that could rupture, the internal bleeding, would be a traumatic experience, one repeated countless times in households across the land. And then came the grim task of dealing with the dead. During major epidemics, normal burial practices often broke down. There simply weren't enough gravediggers, enough coffins, or enough consecrated ground. Mass graves, or plague pits, were dug, into which bodies were thrown, often without ceremony. The psychological impact of such widespread, impersonal death was profound. It could lead to an increase in religious fervour, a sense of fatalism, or even a live for today, for tomorrow we die mentality, with outbreaks of hedonism and lawlessness in some areas. It's like society itself is having a near-death experience. Historians still argue about the long-term social and economic consequences of the Black Death. While devastating in the short term, some argue that the massive population decline led to labour shortages, which eventually empowered surviving peasants to demand better wages and conditions, contributing to the decline of serfdom in some regions. It's a grim silver lining born from unimaginable suffering. Here's a quirky, or rather poignant tidbit related to disease. During plague outbreaks, some people wore or carried pomanders, small, often ornate, perforated balls containing aromatic substances like ambergris, musk, cloves, and other spices. The idea was that breathing in these pleasant scents would ward off the bad air believed to cause the disease. While ineffective medically, they were a small, fragrant attempt to assert some control, some personal protection, in the face of overwhelming and terrifyingly invisible threat. It's a bit like carrying a lucky charm, but one that smells nice, in the hope it might also save your life. Beyond the headline-grabbing terror of the plague, everyday illnesses that are now easily treatable could be death sentences. A simple infection from a cut, remember that lack of hygiene, could lead to sepsis and death. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and child, with high rates of maternal and infant mortality. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, consumption, leprosy. The list of potential killers was long and varied. Life expectancy was short, and experiencing the death of loved ones, especially children, was a common and heartbreaking part of medieval existence. So as you worry about accusations of witchcraft, remember that the medieval world offers a multitude of other ways to meet a premature end. Disease is an unseen, unpredictable enemy, a constant reminder of the fragility of life. It shapes people's worldview, fuels their fears, and contributes to the desperate search for explanations and scapegoats when misfortune strikes. The fear of a witch's curse might be potent, but the fear of the plague, or the sweating sickness, or the bloody flux is a far more tangible and ever-present terror, one that no amount of counter-magic or legal manoeuvring can truly hold at bay. It's a stark reminder that your survival depends on far more than just navigating human malice. You're also at the mercy of the microscopic world, while the invisible enemies of plague and disease wage their relentless war on your medieval existence. There's another, all too visible threat that can bring devastation and suffering to your doorstep. The very human inclination for lords and kings to go to war. You, as a peasant, are unlikely to be strapping on shining armour and charging into glorious battle. That's for the knights and nobles who can afford the expensive kit. Instead, you're far more likely to be on the receiving end of the conflict's brutal consequences, a pawn in games of power played by your supposed betters. Your lord owes military service to his superior, a greater noble, or the king himself, in exchange for his lands. When that call to arms comes, he will gather his knights, men-at-arms, and perhaps a levy of peasant foot soldiers or archers, if the conflict is large enough or desperate enough. If you're a young, able-bodied man, you might find yourself conscripted. Forget your carefully tended turnip patch. You're handed a spear or bow, if you have some skill with it, perhaps from hunting, though poaching was risky, and marched off to fight in a quarrel you likely don't understand and for a cause that offers you little personal benefit. The chances of returning maimed, or not at all, are distressingly high. Medieval battles were brutal, chaotic affairs, and battlefield medicine was, to put it mildly, rudimentary. It's a bit like being an unwilling extra in a very dangerous, very loud historical reenactment where the swords are real. But even if you're not directly pressed into service, war will find a way to make your life miserable. Armies, whether friendly or enemy, need to be fed. And where do you think they get their supplies? They don't exactly pack their own sandwiches. They live off the land. This means your meagre stores of grain, your precious livestock, that pig you are fattening for winter, your only cow, your carefully tended vegetable garden, all are fair game for foraging soldiers. They might offer token payment, or they might just take what they want, leaving you and your family facing starvation. Resistance is usually futile and often met with violence. The passage of an army, even one supposedly on your side, could be as devastating as a swarm of locusts. Then there's the direct violence. If your village happens to lie in the path of an advancing enemy army, or if it's in a disputed territory fought over by rival lords, you are in mortal danger. Villages could be pillaged and burned, not just for supplies, but as a deliberate tactic to demoralize the enemy and deny them resources. Your flimsy wattle and daub hut offers little protection against determined armed men. You and your family might be forced to flee, becoming refugees with nothing but the clothes on your backs, seeking shelter in the woods, or trying to reach the relative safety of a walled town, if one is nearby and willing to let you in. A mainstream historical fact. The 100 Years' War, a series of conflicts fought between England and France from 1337 to 1453, brought widespread devastation to large areas of France. Armies, including mercenary companies known as routiers, or free companies, roamed the countryside, plundering, extorting and terrorising the peasant population during periods of truce or when their pay was in arrears. For the ordinary people caught in these zones, life was a terrifying cycle of violence and insecurity. It's a stark reminder that war's impact extends far beyond the battlefield. The psychological toll of living under constant threat of conflict is immense. The sound of distant hoofbeats or the sight of smoke on the horizon could send a wave of panic through your village. Rumours would fly, uncertainty would reign. Will they come this way? Will they spare us? Should we hide our valuables, if you even have any? It's a life lived on edge, where any semblance of peace or security feels temporary and fragile. Even if your village escapes direct attack, the indirect effects of war are crippling. Lords need money to fund their military campaigns. This often means increased taxes and levies on their peasants. So, on top of your usual rents and obligations, you're now squeezed even harder to pay for wars that bring you no benefit. Failure to pay could result in punishment or the seizure of your few belongings. It's like having your utility bill suddenly triple because your landlord decided to buy a new, very expensive and rather aggressive guard dog. Trade routes are disrupted by conflict, leading to shortages of essential goods that your village might rely on, even if it's just salt or iron for tools. Fields go untended if the men are away fighting or if it's too dangerous to work them. The entire rhythm of agricultural life, already precarious, can be thrown into disarray. The long-term consequences could be famine and increased poverty, even after the fighting stops. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval peasants understood or cared about the larger political causes of the wars they were caught up in. Was there a sense of national identity or loyalty, or was it primarily a matter of allegiance to their immediate lord and a desire to simply be left alone to survive? For many, the grand strategies and dynastic squabbles of kings and nobles must have seemed very remote from the daily struggle for existence. Here's a quirky, or rather grimly practical tidbit. Fortified churches. In some regions prone to conflict or raids, village churches were built with defensive features like thick walls, small windows, and even battlements or towers. They could serve as a place of last resort for the villagers to take refuge in times of attack. Imagine huddling with your family and neighbours inside the cold stone walls of your church, listening to the sounds of fighting outside, praying that the thick oak door holds. It blurs the line between a house of God and a miniature fortress. So while you're trying to avoid being branded a witch and praying you don't catch the sweating sickness, you also have to worry about armoured men on horseback trampling your crops, stealing your food and potentially burning your house down. War in the medieval period wasn't a distant news report. It was a visceral, immediate threat that could erupt at any time, bringing chaos, suffering and death to your doorstep. It's another layer of anxiety, another powerful force shaping your precarious existence, reminding you that your life and livelihood are often at the mercy of decisions made far away by men whose priorities rarely include your well-being. The clash of swords and the ambitions of lords create ripples that can drown the likes of you. Life in your medieval village is undeniably harsh. You're contending with back-breaking labour, the constant threat of disease, the rigid social hierarchy, the unnerving whispers of witchcraft, and the looming shadow of war. It's a relentless grind, a daily struggle for survival. But human beings, even in the bleakest of circumstances, have a remarkable capacity for finding moments of joy, connection, and release. And so, amidst the drudgery, your medieval year would be punctuated by brief, vibrant festivals and holidays that offered a much-needed escape, a chance to forget your troubles, feast a little, if you were lucky, and reaffirm community bonds. These were the medieval equivalents of a long weekend, but with more ale and less restrained dancing. These festivals were often tied to the agricultural calendar or religious observances, blending Christian traditions with much older pre-Christian folk customs. Christmas, Easter and Whitsun, Pentecost, were major religious holidays, celebrated with church services but also with feasting, games and general merriment. The 12 days of Christmas, for example, stretching from Christmas Day to Epiphany, were a traditional period of rest from agricultural labour for those who could afford it, a time for visiting, storytelling and special foods if they were available. Imagine a brief respite from the endless toil, a chance to huddle around the fire with family, sharing stories and perhaps a slightly richer pottage than usual. May Day was a particularly joyous and widely celebrated festival, marking the arrival of spring and the renewal of life. Villagers would rise early to go a-maying, gathering flowers and green branches to decorate their homes and the village. A maypole, a tall pole adorned with ribbons and flowers, would often be erected in the village centre, and people would dance around it. There might be games, music, played on simple instruments like pipes, drums or fiddles, and the crowning of a May Queen and King. It was a celebration of fertility, growth, and the promise of warmer days and a good harvest. It's a far cry from the grim realities of serfdom, a moment of pure, unadulterated communal joy. Harvest festivals, often called Lammas, Loaf Mass, at the beginning of the grain harvest or a harvest home celebration at its conclusion, were occasions for great rejoicing and relief, provided the harvest had been good. After weeks of frantic back-breaking work bringing in the crops, the whole village would come together to feast, drink ale, sing, and dance. The lord of the manor might even provide some food and drink for his tenants as a recognition of their labour. It was a time to celebrate the fruits of their collective effort and to give thanks, both to God and perhaps to the older spirits of the land. These celebrations were vital for morale, a shared reward for a shared struggle, a mainstream historical fact. Guilds in towns and cities often sponsored elaborate pageants and mystery plays, especially on major feast days like Corpus Christi. These plays depicted biblical stories and were performed on pageant wagons that moved through the streets, while you, as a rural peasant, might not have regular access to such sophisticated urban entertainments. Travelling minstrels, jugglers, acrobats and storytellers would occasionally pass through villages, providing a rare and exciting form of entertainment. Their arrival would be a cause for great excitement, a chance to hear news, songs and tales from the wider world. Think of it as medieval Netflix, but live and much less predictable. Saints' days, dedicated to specific patron saints, were also occasions for local celebration. Your village church might be dedicated to a particular saint, and that saint's feast day would be marked with special services and perhaps a local fair or gathering. These fairs were not just for fun, they were also important opportunities for trade, a chance to buy or sell goods, and to socialise with people from neighbouring villages. You might be able to sell some surplus eggs, or a bit of homespun cloth, and buy a new pot or a ribbon for your daughter. Even weddings, while perhaps simpler than modern extravaganzas, were a cause for communal celebration. The whole village would likely participate in the feasting and merrymaking that followed the church ceremony. There would be music, dancing, and probably a good deal of ale consumed. It was a rare opportunity to let loose and celebrate a new union. Historians still argue about the true nature and extent of merry old England or medieval revelry. Was it genuinely a time of widespread carefree fun, or were these festivals merely brief, controlled outlets for a population living under immense pressure, a way for the authorities to let off steam before normal oppressive service was resumed? The reality is likely somewhere in between. These moments were undoubtedly precious, but they were islands of joy in a sea of hardship. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval festivals involved a temporary satirical inversion of the social order. During the Feast of Fools, often celebrated around New Year, lower clergy might elect a Lord of Misrule or a boy bishop and engage in mock religious services, parodies, and general boisterous behaviour within the church itself. While often tolerated, these practices sometimes went too far for the authorities and were periodically condemned and suppressed by the church. It was a way of poking fun at the establishment, a brief moment when the world was turned upside down, before snapping back to its rigid hierarchy. It's like an officially sanctioned day of a very mild, religiously themed rebellion. These festivals, fairs, and holy days, from which we get the word holiday, were more than just a day off work. They were vital for social cohesion, reinforcing community bonds through shared ritual, feasting, and fun. They provided an outlet for creativity with music, dancing, and storytelling. They offered a connection to the rhythms of nature and the spiritual world. In a life that was often solitary and grueling, these moments of collective effervescence were essential for the human spirit. So, as you endure the daily grind, remember that there are these pockets of light. You might look forward to the May Day dances, the harvest feast, or the visit of a travelling storyteller. These are the times when you can laugh, sing, and perhaps for a few precious hours, forget the ever-present anxieties of your medieval life. They're a reminder that even in the harshest of times, the human need for joy, celebration, and connection endures, and you'd better enjoy that ale at the harvest festival, because tomorrow it's back to the turnips. And so, your journey through this imagined medieval life approaches its gentle end. You've awakened in a smoky hut, toiled in the fields under a feudal lord, navigated the rather fragrant realities of medieval hygiene, and subsisted on a diet that made pottage a household name. You've understood your fixed place in society, felt the hum of everyday magic and superstition, and acknowledged the immense power of the church. You've dabbled in herbal healing, only to see how such knowledge could curdle into suspicion. You felt the chilling breath of witchcraft accusations, perhaps even confessed under duress to things you never did, and faced the grim prospect of a sentence born from fear rather than fact. You've also glimpsed the indiscriminate terror of plague and the brutal impact of lords going to war, finding brief, shining moments of respite in communal festivals. As we begin to wind down, let's reflect for a moment on the deep-seated anxieties that permeated this era, anxieties that fueled so much of the hardship and fear we've explored. This wasn't just a time of physical discomfort, it was an age of profound spiritual and existential insecurity. The world, for many medieval people, was a battleground between good and evil, God and the devil, and humanity was caught in the middle. Misfortune, whether a failed harvest, a sudden illness, a stillborn child, or a storm that ravaged the village, wasn't merely bad luck or a random occurrence. It often demanded an explanation, a cause, and frequently a culprit. The fear of the unknown was immense. In a world without widespread scientific understanding, where literacy was rare and news travelled slowly and unreliably, inexplicable events could easily be interpreted through a supernatural lens. That sudden pain in your side, not indigestion perhaps, but a witch's curse. That cow that died unexpectedly, not disease, but demonic interference. This mindset made people vulnerable to believing in and seeking out scapegoats. When communities faced hardship, finding someone to blame, an outsider, a marginalised individual, someone different, could offer a perverse sense of control, a way to direct anger and fear towards a tangible target. The fear of God's wrath was also a powerful force. Natural disasters, plagues, and famines were often interpreted as divine punishment for the sins of humanity, or at least the sins of a particular community. This created a collective anxiety, a need to appease God through prayer, penance, and the rooting out of perceived ungodliness, which could, tragically, include those accused of witchcraft seen as agents of the ultimate evil. It's a heavy burden to feel that your community's suffering might be tied to its moral failings or the presence of a hidden enemy within. A mainstream historical fact relating to this anxious age is the phenomenon of dancing manias, or choreomania, that occurred sporadically in continental Europe, particularly between the 14th and 17th centuries. Large groups of people would dance erratically, sometimes for days, seemingly unable to stop, often accompanied by convulsions, visions, and exhaustion, occasionally leading to death. Historians and psychologists still debate the causes: mass hysteria, ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, extreme psychological distress in response to calamities like the plague, but it serves as a striking example of how societal stress and anxiety could manifest in bizarre and alarming ways. Imagine seeing hundreds of people uncontrollably, almost demonically, dancing in the streets. It would surely feed into fears of supernatural malevolence. The Church, while offering solace and a path to salvation, also contributed to these anxieties through its emphasis on sin, damnation, and the constant threat of demonic temptation. The vivid depictions of hell, the detailed catalogues of sins, the stories of saints battling demons, all reinforced the idea of a world teetering on the brink, where eternal salvation was a hard-won prize and eternal torment a very real possibility. Historians still argue whether the medieval period was truly a dark age of unremitting fear and superstition, or if this picture is overly simplistic. There were undoubtedly centres of learning, beauty in art and architecture, acts of charity, and profound expressions of faith and human resilience. However, for the average peasant, life was undeniably precarious, lived close to the bone, with a constant awareness of potential dangers, both seen and unseen. This undercurrent of anxiety is crucial to understanding why something like a witch craze could take hold, why communities could turn on their own, and why you wouldn't last a day if you couldn't adapt to this profoundly different way of seeing and experiencing the world. Our journey tonight has been about more than just the grim details of why you wouldn't survive as a medieval witch. It's been an exploration of a mindset, a worldview so different from our own. It's a world where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were porous, where faith and fear walked hand in hand, and where survival depended not just on your strength or cunning, but on your ability to navigate a complex web of social obligations, religious duties, and ever-present dangers. As the light of our historical exploration begins to dim, and the sounds of the medieval village fade into the quiet of your own, hopefully much more comfortable, surroundings carry with you not just the shiver of its hardships, but also a deeper appreciation for the comforts and certainties of your own time. The anxieties of the medieval peasant were profound, etched into the very fabric of their existence. Their fears gave rise to explanations and actions that seem alien, even cruel to us now. But they were born from a world wrestling with mysteries we have, in many ways, managed to solve, or at least to understand differently. The echoes of that anxious age remind us of how far we've come, and perhaps how thin the veneer of our own certainty can sometimes be. The shadows of the past grow long now, and the hardships of that distant era begin to recede, replaced by the gentle call of approaching slumber. The anxieties of medieval life, the fear of the unknown, the struggle for survival, can all be laid to rest as your own world, with its softer edges and quieter nights, reasserts itself. Let the rhythmic cadence of these closing thoughts guide you toward a peaceful state of repose. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth fades, replaced by the familiar comfort of your own linens, your own quiet room. The clatter of wooden shoes on cobblestones, the distant tolling of a church bell, the whispered accusations, all these sounds soften now, drifting away like leaves on a gentle stream. There are no more fields to toil in before dawn, no suspicious eyes watching your every move, no need to decipher omens in the flight of a bird or the phase of the moon. That world, with all its starkness and its strange, fearful beauty, can now recede into the mists of history, a story told, a journey completed. Allow your muscles to relax, your breathing to deepen, your mind to clear. The trials and tribulations of that long ago time are not yours to bear. You're safe, you are secure, and a night of untroubled sleep awaits you. Let the peace of the present moment envelop you like the softest blanket, and drift gently now into sweet dreams,